At Thanksgiving dinner, my parents laid down the law. Your job is to slave so your brother can enjoy his life, they said. If you have a problem with that, there is the door. I did not cry. I looked at them across the table and said, fine. I will walk out and you can start paying your own bills. Their smiles vanished instantly. Before I explain how I used their own greed to dismantle their lives, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you love seeing toxic people destroyed by their own entitlement. The dining room of the suburban estate smelled of roasted sage and expensive wine. I sat near the kitchen entrance wearing a faded wool sweater, peeling green apples with a small paring knife. The crystal chandelier cast a warm glow over the mahogany table. My 30-year-old brother Julian sat at the head of the table. He wore a tailored linen shirt holding a glass of Pinot Noir. He called himself a startup entrepreneur. He spent his days attending networking brunches and posting motivational quotes online. Tonight he had an announcement. His latest venture required a sudden injection of capital. He stated he needed $100,000 by the end of the month to save his company. Richard and Helen, my parents, did not ask Julian why his business was bleeding cash. They turned their heads and looked directly at me. Richard rested his elbows on the table. He told me to liquidate my savings accounts immediately. Helen chimed in, adding that I needed to take out a high-interest personal loan to cover the remaining balance. I kept peeling the apple. The knife sliced through the green skin in one continuous ribbon. I told them no. The temperature in the room shifted. Helen narrowed her eyes, setting her wine glass down hard on the coaster. She delivered her verdict. She told me I was nothing but a freelance accountant with zero ambition. Julian was the visionary of the family. My duty was to fund his lifestyle and bear the burden of the labor. If I refused to play my role, I could pack my bags and walk out the front door tonight. I placed the knife on the cutting board. A childhood spent sacrificing my own medical school scholarships to pay off Julian and his past debts had cured me of any familial affection. I pulled my phone from my pocket. I opened my banking portal. Right there at the dinner table, I systematically canceled the recurring automated payments attached to my routing numbers. I severed the funding for their platinum credit cards, the estate property taxes, the utility bills, and the luxury car leases. I locked the screen and slid the phone back into my pocket. I told them I was leaving and the power company would sever their electricity by next Tuesday. Silence hung over the roasted turkey. Then Julian let out a short, breathy laugh. He leaned back in his leather chair, swirling his wine. He told me I was acting petty over pocket change. He claimed my accountant's salary was no longer required. He leaned forward, a predatory grin spreading across his face. He announced he had just secured a private angel investor. A ghost financier was wiring $500,000 into his corporate account first thing Monday morning. He looked me in the eye and said my financial usefulness had officially expired. I left the dining room without raising my voice or offering a single word of protest. The heavy oak stairs creaked under my weight as I ascended to the second floor of the estate. My bedroom remained virtually unchanged since high school. It lacked the imported rugs, the expensive modern artwork, and the custom furniture that decorated Julian and his wife's living quarters down the hall. My space was sparse and functional. I pulled a canvas duffel bag from the closet shelf and began folding my clothes. The repetitive mechanical motion of packing brought a familiar bitter taste to the back of my throat. I tossed a thick medical biology textbook into the bottom of the bag. My fingers lingered on the worn, rigid cover. A decade ago, I held an acceptance letter to a prestigious medical program. I earned a full scholarship through years of relentless study. Richard and Helen intercepted the mail. They sat me down at the kitchen table on a cold Tuesday evening and informed me the supplementary tuition and housing funds were gone. Julian had racked up a staggering underground poker debt playing with individuals who did not forgive outstanding ledgers. My parents liquidated my college savings to protect his kneecaps. Richard stood by the window smoking a cigar, while Helen handed me a schedule for a local accounting firm. They ordered me to drop the medical scholarship and pick up double shifts to rebuild the family emergency fund. That was the exact moment I stopped being their daughter and became their designated financial shield. They viewed my intellect only as a tool to subsidize his failures. I zipped the duffel bag shut. I did not feel sorrow. I felt the cold, razor-sharp clarity of a predator preparing a trap. I sat at my small wooden desk and opened my laptop. My family believed I spent my days balancing basic spreadsheets for local bakeries and dental offices. They required me to be a low-level freelance accountant so they could feel superior at family gatherings. I maintained the illusion flawlessly, wearing faded sweaters and driving an older sedan. In reality, The encrypted device resting on my desk granted me direct administrative access to institutional trading nodes and proprietary venture capital databases. I operated as a shadow partner for a prominent private equity firm, utilizing a network of anonymous corporate entities to manage high-yield investments. I typed a sequence of complex passwords bypassing the primary firewalls. I wanted to see the architecture of Julian's sudden miracle. A legitimate angel investor injecting $500,000 into a failing startup leaves an undeniable digital footprint. Real venture capital requires term sheets, equity dilution agreements, board seats, and rigorous federal filings. Investors demand revenue projections and competent leadership. Julian possessed neither of those qualities. I ran a forensic query on his corporate registration number, filtering the results through the state commercial registry. The screen illuminated with raw financial routing data. Julian did not secure an angel investor. The incoming wire transfer pending for Monday morning originated from a shadow credit institution. It was a mezzanine fund. In the corporate finance sector, mezzanine debt is a predatory financial instrument. It is hybrid capital utilized by desperate borrowers who have exhausted traditional bank loans. Shadow lenders offer rapid cash with exorbitant interest rates, but they secure the loan against hard physical assets. The contracts are engineered to fail. If the borrower misses a single payment or breaches a minor covenant, the lender executes a rapid legal takeover, stripping the equity overnight. It is a loan-to-own strategy. Julian had walked into a trap designed to swallow failing entrepreneurs alive. I dug deeper, tracing the specific collateral attached to his pending loan. A mezzanine lender does not hand over $500,000 based on a motivational speech and a firm handshake. They require blood. The digital ledger populated the collateral index. My brother had secretly leveraged the very ground beneath his feet. He used the suburban estate, the exact house Richard and Helen were currently sitting in, as the primary asset to secure his shadow loan. He was gambling their roof to fund his failing vanity project. He forged the preliminary equity checks, assuming his startup would generate millions before the first payment came due. A sharp, rhythmic tapping sounded against the wooden doorframe. I did not close the laptop. I simply minimized the secure financial window, bringing up a blank spreadsheet. Naomi stood in the doorway, blocking my exit. My sister-in-law wore a tailored cashmere cardigan and held a crystal glass of champagne. As an African-American woman who prided herself on projecting high society elegance, she constantly manufactured an aura of untouchable wealth. She claimed to be the founder and chief executive of a boutique public relations agency downtown. In truth, her firm produced zero actual revenue. It served as a vanity project designed to justify her expensive networking lunches and her designer wardrobe. She hosted lavish launch parties for products that never shipped and represented clients who paid her in trade rather than currency. She survived by bleeding the family resources dry right alongside her husband. Naomi took a slow sip of her champagne, surveying my canvas duffel bag with a look of profound amusement. She leaned against the doorframe, crossing her legs at the ankles. "You are throwing a childish tantrum over nothing, Clara," she said, her voice dripping with practiced condescension. "Julian is about to secure $500,000. He is finally entering the major leagues. We do not need your pocket change to survive anymore. We are simply asking you to contribute your fair share to the household while you live under this roof." I kept my expression blank. "Then step aside and let me leave," I replied. Naomi did not move. Her amused smile hardened into a tight, calculated line. She swirled the champagne in her glass, the bubbles rising to the surface. "Before you march out into the cold night playing the victim, there is an outstanding invoice you need to settle," she stated, her tone shifting from mockery to a direct command. "I booked a first-class flight and a private luxury chalet in Aspen for next weekend. It is a vital networking trip for my public relations agency. I have meetings scheduled with top-tier media executives. My assistant forwarded the itinerary to your email this morning. You need to clear the payment tonight before the reservation expires." I looked at the woman, demanding I fund her luxury ski vacation while I was in the middle of being evicted by my own parents. "I am not paying for your winter retreat, Naomi," I said, keeping my voice even and devoid of emotion. "Start packing your own bags." Naomi stepped into the room. The heavy scent of her expensive designer perfume filled the narrow space, replacing the smell of the roasted dinner downstairs. She did not yell. She did not throw the champagne glass. She resorted to cold, calculated extortion. She lowered her voice to a harsh, menacing whisper. "You are a freelance accountant, Clara." She began, her eyes narrowing as she studied my face. "You deal in small businesses. You take cash under the table. I know exactly how people like you operate. You hide your earnings to avoid bumping into a higher tax bracket. She walked closer, stopping just inches from my desk. She tapped her manicured fingernail against the closed lid of my laptop. If you do not authorize the payment for my Aspen trip by midnight tonight, I am picking up my phone, she threatened. I will dial the Internal Revenue Service. I will submit a formal whistleblower tip regarding your unreported income and your fraudulent bookkeeping. The Criminal Investigation Division of the federal government does not send polite letters, Clara. They send armed agents. They will audit every single spreadsheet you possess. They will freeze your meager bank accounts and drag you into a federal court for tax evasion. You will pay for my vacation tonight, or I will send the government to destroy your quiet little life. I looked at the woman standing in my childhood bedroom attempting to weaponize the federal government over a luxury ski vacation. Naomi wore her designer cashmere and held her crystal flute, projecting an aura of supreme confidence. She expected me to panic. She assumed my freelance accounting business was built on cash under the table and fabricated deductions. Her understanding of the financial world was gathered entirely from television dramas and gossip columns. She did not comprehend that true wealth operates in the blinding light of legal compliance. My tax returns were filed by a premier corporate accounting firm utilizing airtight offshore structures and legitimate venture capital depreciation schedules. The Internal Revenue Service audited my holding companies annually and found pristine ledgers every single time. I did not flinch. I did not offer a frantic explanation or a plea for mercy. I reached into my duffel bag and pulled out my smartphone. I unlocked the screen and held the device out toward her. "Dial the number, Naomi," I instructed, keeping my voice flat and surgical. She blinked, her confidence faltering for a fraction of a second. She did not reach for the phone. "To file a formal whistleblower tip, you need Internal Revenue Service Form 211. I explained, outlining the precise legal mechanics of her hollow threat. "You must provide specific, credible evidence of tax fraud. You cannot just call a hotline and issue a vague accusation born out of spite. The Criminal Investigation Division requires a sworn declaration under penalty of perjury. If you lie to federal agents to initiate a fraudulent audit, you will face felony charges." I took a step closer, forcing her to look directly into my eyes. "I will dictate the toll-free number for the financial crimes tip line right now," I offered. "Call them. Tell them to send their forensic auditors to this house. I welcome the scrutiny. But remember that when federal agents open an investigation, they audit the entire household. They will look at my ledgers, and then they will look at your public relations agency. They will demand to see the revenue streams funding your designer wardrobe and your first-class flights. Are your books pristine, Naomi?" The color drained from her face, leaving her complexion a pale ashen shade. She swallowed hard, her throat working against a sudden wave of dry panic. Her public relations firm was a hollow shell company used to funnel money from Julian and, by extension, from me. A federal audit would obliterate her fake empire in a matter of hours. She knew it, and she realized I knew it too. She took a slow step backward, breaking eye contact. The extortion play evaporated. But a narcissist stripped of leverage must immediately reassert dominance to protect their fragile ego. She refused to accept defeat in a room she deemed beneath her status. Naomi shifted her tactics. She pulled a sleek platinum credit card from the pocket of her cashmere cardigan. The plastic bore my name embossed in raised silver lettering, but it had resided in her designer wallet for the past 3 years. She treated my credit line as her personal unlimited grant. "You think you hold the power because you canceled a few automated utility bills?" She sneered, her voice trembling slightly as she attempted to regain the upper hand. "I do not need your permission to book my travel." She retrieved her own phone and opened a premium airline booking application. She navigated to the reservation page for the Aspen trip. She typed with frantic, disjointed keystrokes, her manicured nails clicking sharply against the glass screen. She selected a first-class seat and a private luxury chalet. The total cost hovered near $12,000. She inputted the security code on the back of the platinum card and pressed the confirmation button, holding the screen up for me to witness her triumph. A spinning loading wheel appeared on the interface. The digital gateway contacted the issuing bank. The seconds stretched in the quiet room. The screen flashed. A stark red error banner dropped across the top of the application. "Transaction declined. Please contact the issuing institution." Naomi stared at the glowing red text. Her jaw tightened. She pressed the submit button a second time, assuming a network error. The system rejected the request instantly. She tried a third time. The application locked the payment gateway, citing suspected fraudulent activity due to multiple failed attempts. The reality of the situation finally penetrated her manufactured arrogance. The financial faucet was shut off. The platinum card was nothing more than a useless piece of plastic. The luxury vacations, the expensive dinners, the designer clothes were all dead. I had severed her lifeline right at the dinner table, and the bank enforced my decree. A primal, unhinged rage washed over her features. The polished, high society persona shattered. She let out a sharp, guttural scream of pure frustration. She raised her right hand and hurled the crystal champagne flute across the room. The expensive glass struck the wooden door frame, shattering into 100 glittering shards. The sharp, concussive sound of breaking crystal echoed down the quiet suburban hallway, followed by the distinct splash of spilled champagne soaking into the hallway runner. Naomi stood breathing heavy, her chest heaving as she stared at the ruined glass. She had no words left. She turned on her heel and stormed down the corridor, retreating to her own suite. I ignored the broken glass and turned back to my duffel bag. I needed to finish packing, but the loud crash had summoned the ultimate authority figure of the household. Heavy, deliberate footsteps pounded on the oak staircase. The sound carried the distinct rhythm of a man marching to assert his dominance. Richard appeared in the doorway, his face flushed a deep shade of crimson. He wore a heavy wool sweater and carried the scent of roasted turkey and expensive scotch. He looked at the shattered crystal on the floor and then locked his furious gaze on me. He did not ask what happened. He did not care about Naomi or her tantrum. He viewed the disturbance as an opportunity to crush the rebellion I started at the dinner table. Richard stepped into my bedroom holding a crisp, printed document in his right hand. He marched toward my desk and slammed the paper down next to my laptop. I looked down at the document. It was an eviction notice. The header bore the seal of the county court, but a quick glance revealed it was a generic template printed from a cheap online legal depository. The blank spaces were filled in with blue ink bearing his harsh, jagged handwriting. "You think you can sit at my table, eat my food, and disrespect this family?" Richard snarled, his voice vibrating with patriarchal fury. "You think shutting off the credit cards gives you leverage in my house? You forget who provides the roof over your head, Clara." He tapped a thick finger against the printed paper. "This is a formal notice to vacate the premises," he declared, citing the legal fiction he just manufactured. "I am the landlord of this estate. You are a tenant, and your tenancy is hereby terminated. You have exactly 10 minutes to gather whatever garbage you can fit into that canvas bag and walk out the front door." I studied the printed paper, noting the misspelled legal terms and the lack of a proper notary seal. Richard stood tall, crossing his arms over his chest, puffing out his chest to project an imposing physical threat. He utilized the oldest tactic in his arsenal. He weaponized shelter. He took another step forward, closing the distance between us. His eyes darted to the small silver keyring resting on my bedside table. "And you are leaving the car keys," he added, a cruel, vindictive smile twisting his lips. "The silver sedan parked in the driveway is registered in my name. I paid the down payment 4 years ago. You will not steal my property on your way out. You are going to walk down that driveway with nothing but the clothes on your back." He delivered his ultimatum, believing he had engineered the perfect psychological trap. The temperature outside hovered near freezing. It was Thanksgiving night. The suburban streets were dark and empty. He expected the harsh reality of the cold night and the prospect of homelessness to break my resolve. He waited for the tears to form. He anticipated the moment my shoulders would slump in defeat. He wanted me to drop to my knees, apologize for my ungrateful behavior, and beg for permission to stay in my childhood bedroom. He wanted me to promise to fund Julian and his startup just to keep the keys to the sedan. He stood in the doorway, blocking the exit, radiating the smug satisfaction of a man who believed he held absolute control over my existence. He assumed his name on a piece of paper granted him supreme authority over the estate. He demanded I walk out into the freezing night, leaving everything behind. Richard stood in the doorway, radiating artificial authority. He waited for the inevitable breakdown. He expected me to clutch the silver keys and plead for shelter. He wanted to watch his daughter beg for the privilege of sleeping in her childhood bed. He operated on a toxic script written decades ago, relying on financial intimidation to enforce compliance. I reached over to the bedside table. My fingers brushed the cold metal ring. I picked up the keys. I did not look at them with any lingering attachment. I opened my hand and let them drop. The heavy keys hit the hardwood floor with a sharp metallic clatter, stopping inches from the toe of his leather shoe. I told him he could keep the sedan. A cheap car leased under a suffocating interest rate was a liability I had no desire to maintain. Richard frowned. The script in his head was unraveling. He pointed a thick finger at the printed eviction notice resting on my desk. He reiterated his demand that I vacate his property immediately, warning me that the temperature outside was dropping below freezing. I did not bother looking at the generic legal template. I reached into my canvas duffel bag and extracted a sleek, encrypted tablet. The screen illuminated, casting a pale blue glow across the dim room. I bypassed the biometric security and opened a secure web browser. I navigated directly to the official government portal for the County Registry of Deeds. True leverage requires immutable documentation. I typed the address of the suburban estate into the search bar. The database queried the state records, pulling the certified property history. 3 years ago, Richard executed a series of disastrous margin calls trying to cover a failed tech venture Julian had pitched. The resulting financial crater swallowed the remaining equity in this house. The primary mortgage holder issued a formal notice of default. Richard hid the letters in his study, hoping for a miracle that would never arrive. The bank initiated foreclosure proceedings. Before the property hit the public auction block, I intervened. I did not hand Richard a check to save his pride. I utilized a corporate attorney to purchase the distressed debt directly from the bank through an anonymous holding company registered in Delaware. I paid the outstanding balance in cash and quietly assumed the deed. I let them live here, believing they still owned the estate because a false sense of security made them easier to observe. The tablet screen populated with the official digital record. The transfer of ownership was recorded 36 months ago. The current legal owner of the estate was listed as Horizon Capital Ventures, LLC. I opened a secondary window displaying the corporate articles of organization for the holding company. The document clearly named me as the sole managing member and majority shareholder. I turned the tablet around, holding the glowing screen up for my father to read. I instructed Richard to read the legal owner designation. He squinted at the screen. His eyes scanned the digital text, tracking the chain of title. The smug satisfaction drained from his features, replaced by a hollow, uncomprehending stare. "You do not own this house, Richard," I stated, delivering the truth with cold precision. "You have not owned the ground beneath your feet for 3 years. The bank foreclosed on your mortgage when you defaulted on the payments. I bought the deed through a blind trust to keep this family off the street." I tapped his printed eviction notice with my index finger. "You cannot evict me from my own property," I explained, outlining the legal reality. "You are not a landlord. You are a tenant who has lived rent-free, subsidized by the daughter you just tried to throw out into the cold night. That piece of paper is a worthless fiction. If anyone is leaving this estate, it will be the people who no longer possess a valid lease." Richard stood paralyzed. The illusion of his patriarchal dominance shattered into dust. The house he used to threaten me was a cage I owned. His shoulders slumped. The heavy wool sweater suddenly looked too large for his frame. He opened his mouth to formulate a defense, but the cognitive dissonance robbed him of his vocabulary. He stared at the keys on the floor, realizing they represented a car he could no longer afford to fuel. Before he could regain his composure, a frantic voice echoed from the downstairs hallway. Heavy footsteps pounded on the oak staircase. Julian rushed up the stairs, taking them 2 at a time. He burst into my bedroom, ignoring our father standing frozen in the doorway. Julian gripped his smartphone so tightly his knuckles turned white. The tailored linen shirt he wore at the dinner table was stained with nervous sweat beneath the arms. He looked like a man who had just stared over the edge of a cliff and felt the ground crumbling beneath his boots. The arrogance of the startup entrepreneur evaporated, leaving behind a terrified child facing the consequences of a lethal miscalculation. "The mezzanine fund," called Julian. He gasped, his voice cracking under the intense pressure. The shadow lenders were running their final compliance checks before authorizing the $500,000 wire transfer scheduled for Monday morning. Predatory lenders do not rely on verbal assurances. They execute rigorous due diligence on all physical collateral. Their underwriters pulled the county property records to verify the asset. They found the exact same digital ledger I just showed Richard. The fund discovered Julian did not own the suburban estate. He offered a property he had zero legal claim to as the primary security for a massive commercial loan. Offering property you do not own to secure corporate financing constitutes felony bank fraud. The shadow lenders did not care about Julian or his visionary startup dreams. They cared about strict risk mitigation. They terminated the loan agreement instantly. The $5 million valuation, the angel investor narrative, the entire future Julian built in his head vanished in a single phone call. But predatory lenders do not walk away empty-handed when a borrower attempts to defraud them. They enforce the punitive clauses buried deep within the fine print of the underwriting contract. Julian held his phone out his hand, trembling visibly. "The fund manager invoked the breach of contract provision," he explained. They are demanding a $50,000 penalty fee for fraudulent misrepresentation. The payment is due in cash before midnight tonight. Julian looked at me, his eyes wide with primal terror. He abandoned his previous mockery. He begged me to unlock the family credit cards. He pleaded for an emergency wire transfer from my accounting accounts. He confessed he had zero liquid capital to his name. The networking brunches and the tailored shirts were funded entirely by the credit lines I had severed downstairs. I leaned against my wooden desk, watching him sweat. I asked him what the fund would do if he missed the midnight deadline. Julian swallowed hard, a look of pure dread washing over his face. To secure the high-risk mezzanine debt, he required a secondary guarantor. He convinced Naomi to sign the underwriting documents, utilizing her boutique public relations firm as the backup collateral. He promised her the startup would generate immediate returns, shielding her from any actual financial exposure. The lenders invoked the cross-collateralization provision, Julian whispered, staring at the floor. If I fail to wire the $50,000 before midnight, the fund will dispatch an asset recovery team. They hold a primary lien on her corporate entity. They will seize every computer server, bank account, and client ledger tied to Naomi and her agency. They will liquidate her business by sunrise to recoup the penalty fee. Julian was staring at imminent financial execution. The clock was ticking toward midnight. He had tied his fake empire to his wife's vanity project, and now both entities were standing on the trapdoor with the rope around their necks. The brother who told me to slave for his benefit was now begging for a fraction of the wealth he assumed I did not possess. The heavy footsteps that echoed in the hallway did not belong to a federal agent or a shadow lender. Naomi stepped into the bedroom doorway. She had retreated to her suite after her platinum card declined, but the thin walls of the suburban estate offered no acoustic privacy. She heard Julian rushing up the stairs. She heard his frantic confession regarding the mezzanine fund and the canceled loan. The tailored cashmere cardigan she wore now looked less like a symbol of high society elegance and more like a fragile shield she was desperately trying to hold together. Naomi looked at her husband standing near my desk. Julian was sweating, his hands trembling, his eyes darting across the room. The polished facade of the wealthy tech entrepreneur dissolved before her eyes. She realized the man she married was a hollow fraud. He did not possess a multi-million-dollar valuation. He did not have a roster of angel investors. He was a desperate gambler who used her boutique public relations agency as a human shield against a predatory lending syndicate. She walked slowly into the room, ignoring Richard, who remained frozen near the doorframe. Naomi stopped in front of Julian and slapped him across the face. The sharp crack of her palm striking his cheek echoed in the quiet bedroom. Julian stumbled backward, holding his face, unable to muster a single word of defense. "You leveraged my company," Naomi hissed, her voice vibrating with cold, venomous fury. "You took the firm I built, the brand I cultivated, and you handed it to a shadow bank to cover your lies. The asset recovery team is going to seize my servers and my client ledgers by sunrise because you do not own the ground you stand on." Julian kept his head down, staring at the hardwood floor, a pathetic portrait of a ruined man. Naomi turned her wrath toward Richard. The patriarch of the family, who had spent years treating her like a prized acquisition, now looked like a deflated balloon. She mocked his artificial aristocracy. She laughed at his tailored wool sweater and his pretentious cigars, realizing he was nothing more than a broke tenant living rent-free in a house owned by the daughter he constantly degraded. She stripped away their collective dignity with precise surgical insults, leaving them exposed as a family of parasites. But Naomi was a survivor in her own twisted ecosystem. She understood that insulting her ruined husband and his bankrupt father would not satisfy the mezzanine fund. The shadow lenders required $50,000 in liquid cash before midnight. There was only one person in the room who possessed that kind of capital. Naomi turned her attention to me. The anger in her eyes mutated into a sharp, predatory calculation. She knew I'd bought the foreclosed estate. She knew I possessed the financial architecture to execute high-level real estate transactions. She realized my freelance accountant persona was a brilliant camouflage. "You are going to pay the penalty fee, Clara," she commanded, holding out her hand as if expecting me to place a stack of $100 bills into her palm. "You are going to wire the $50,000 to the fund right now and release my public relations firm from the collateral lien." I remained seated at my desk, my hands resting on the keyboard of my laptop. I told her I had zero intention of paying her husband's debts or saving her hollow vanity project. Naomi did not throw another tantrum. She did not scream or hurl an object across the room. A narcissist facing terminal ruin will utilize their darkest leverage to survive. She reached into the pocket of her cashmere cardigan and extracted her smartphone. She tapped the screen, navigating past her social media applications, and opened a secure, encrypted audio folder. "I anticipated your stubbornness," Naomi said, a dark, triumphant smile creeping across her face. "You always think you hold the moral high ground. You think you can just pack a duffel bag and walk away from this family, leaving us to drown. But you are tethered to us, Clara. You are bound to our dirt." She adjusted the volume on her device and pressed the play button. The audio recording was clear, capturing the ambient sounds of a summer evening. I heard the distinct clinking of crystal wine glasses and the gentle hum of the patio heater. It was a covert recording captured on the back deck of the estate late last year. Richard's voice echoed from the small speaker. He sounded relaxed, confident, intoxicated by his own cleverness. "The clinic processes the Medicare payout in 48 hours, Richard said on the recording. "It is a flawless system." Helen's voice chimed in, followed by a soft, amused laugh. "She will never notice," Helen added. "Clara never checks her credit reports. She is too busy crunching numbers for those pathetic local bakeries. As long as the billing address routes to our post office box, the federal notices will never reach her desk. We just run the phantom physical therapy sessions through her Social Security number, and the Treasury deposits the checks directly into our joint account." The recording captured my parents casually discussing the mechanics of federal healthcare fraud. They were sitting on their patio drinking expensive wine, confessing to stealing tens of thousands of dollars from the United States government, using their own daughter as the primary vehicle for the crime. Naomi paused the audio. The silence in the bedroom grew thick and suffocating. Richard turned a sickly shade of gray, his eyes wide with terror as he realized his private confession was just weaponized against him. "Identity theft and Medicare fraud," Naomi stated, outlining the legal parameters of her extortion with chilling clarity. "Your parents stole your Social Security number. They billed the federal government for expensive diagnostic imaging and rehabilitation treatments you never received. They funneled the federal payouts to cover Julian and his endless networking expenses." She held the phone up, treating the digital file like a loaded firearm pointed directly at my chest. "If you do not authorize the wire transfer to the mezzanine fund before midnight, I am forwarding this audio file to the Federal Bureau of Investigation," Naomi threatened. "I will send it to the Office of the Inspector General. They will dispatch federal agents to this house. They will arrest Richard and Helen and sentence them to a decade in a federal penitentiary." Naomi took a step closer, lowering her voice to a harsh whisper. "And they will arrest you too, Clara," she promised. "You are the designated family accountant. You handle their taxes. The federal prosecutors will look at the fraudulent Treasury deposits, and they will assume you were the architect of the scheme. They will classify you as a co-conspirator. They will freeze your hidden bank accounts, seize this estate, and strip your professional licenses. You will go down with them. $50,000 is a very cheap price to keep your freedom. Pay the penalty fee." Richard opened his mouth, trying to formulate a defense, trying to apologize for the betrayal, but the words died in his throat. He looked at me with the pathetic, pleading eyes of a man begging his victim for salvation. I did not look at my father. I did not hyperventilate or beg Naomi to delete the file. When a predator reveals their ultimate weapon, a seasoned strategist does not flinch. They evaluate the structural integrity of the threat. I turned my chair away from Naomi and faced the glowing screen of my laptop. I opened a new encrypted browser window. I bypassed the standard commercial search engines and accessed the direct secure portal for the Federal Tax and Social Security Administration. I inputted my identification numbers, utilizing biometric authentication, to clear the institutional firewalls. The screen populated with my comprehensive identity history. I navigated to the federal healthcare billing ledgers. I needed to verify the magnitude of the betrayal. The data loaded in stark black and white rows. Naomi was not bluffing. The recording was a precise reflection of reality. My parents had utilized a network of ghost clinics located in Florida and Texas to submit fraudulent claims under my identity. The ledger showed continuous billing for expensive procedures. Tens of thousands of dollars in illicit funds were dispersed to routing numbers controlled by Richard. They had transformed my clean identity into a conduit for federal theft. The betrayal was profound, but I felt no emotional pain. The young girl who craved their affection died a long time ago. I analyzed the data, reading the billing codes and the deposit timestamps. I looked at the screen, and then I looked at Naomi. She stood near my desk, gripping her phone, waiting for me to surrender. She believed she had executed a flawless checkmate. She assumed the threat of federal prison would force me to liquidate my assets and save her boutique public relations firm. She failed to recognize the fatal flaw in her own calculation. Naomi was standing in the room issuing a demand for $50,000 under the explicit threat of exposing a felony. She was utilizing a covert recording of a federal crime to extort capital to save a corporate entity she pledged to a shadow lender. That specific action constitutes felony extortion under federal law. Furthermore, she was extorting money to save a corporate entity, her public relations firm that was already pledged as collateral to a predatory lending syndicate. Instead of panicking, I realized Naomi had just handed me the exact tool required to dismantle the entire family structure. She thought she was holding a shield to protect her vanity project. She did not realize she was holding a live grenade, and she had just handed me the pin. I looked at Naomi standing in my childhood bedroom, gripping her smartphone like a loaded weapon. She expected me to panic. She calculated that my fear of a federal prison sentence would override my financial discipline, forcing me to authorize a $50,000 wire transfer to save her boutique public relations firm. She assumed I would liquidate my own assets to protect the family secret. I did not reach for my laptop keyboard. I did not offer a frantic plea for mercy. I picked up my phone and dialed a private offshore number. High-tier corporate attorneys do not observe national holidays. A 7-figure annual retainer ensures they answer the phone before the third ring. Sterling picked up the line. I did not offer a casual holiday greeting. I instructed him to open a secure encrypted channel to the Office of the Inspector General. I told him we were initiating a priority whistleblower report regarding systemic Medicare fraud and federal identity theft. Naomi frowned. Her grip on her phone loosened slightly. Richard took a stumbling step forward, his face pale and slick with a sudden sheen of cold sweat. I kept my eyes locked on Naomi as I dictated the parameters of the crime to my attorney. I provided the names of the ghost clinics located in Florida and Texas. I detailed how my Social Security number was utilized to funnel illicit federal Treasury deposits into a joint checking account controlled by my parents. I ordered Sterling to file the preliminary injunction and request an immediate federal safe harbor declaration for myself. I ended the call and placed my phone back on the wooden desk. Naomi stared at me, her lips parted in silent confusion. She lacked the sophisticated legal vocabulary to comprehend the maneuver I had just executed. You think blackmail requires silence, I said, keeping my tone even and surgical. You assume the threat of exposure forces the victim into immediate compliance. That logic only applies to the guilty. I pointed at her smartphone. You can delete that audio file, or you can email it directly to the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. It no longer holds any currency, I explained. The federal government operates a highly structured whistleblower program. When a victim of identity theft proactively reports the fraud and hands over the primary evidence, they are granted immediate statutory immunity. I just turned myself in as the primary witness for the prosecution. I am shielded from any collateral charges. Naomi took a slow step backward, the heel of her designer shoe crunching against the shattered crystal on the hardwood floor. My parents are going to face a severe federal indictment. I continued outlining the architecture of her failure. But your situation is far more precarious, Naomi. You just stood in my bedroom and demanded a $50,000 payout. You used a covert audio recording of a federal crime to extort capital to save a corporate entity you pledged to a shadow lender. That constitutes felony extortion. When the federal agents arrive to audit this estate, I will hand them the security footage from the hallway cameras documenting your threat. You brought a recorded conversation to a legal gunfight, and you just shot yourself in the foot. The fabricated elegance Naomi wore vanished. The cashmere cardigan offered no protection against the chilling reality of a federal extortion charge. She dropped her phone into her pocket and fled the room, pushing past Richard, who remained frozen in the doorway, mourning the death of his aristocratic illusion. During the precise execution of Naomi, I stepped toward the window to observe the dark suburban street. I turned my back to the hallway for less than 30 seconds. That narrow window of distraction provided Julian the exact opening he required. My brother was a desperate animal backed into a lethal corner by the mezzanine fund. He needed $50,000 before midnight to prevent the asset recovery team from liquidating his wife's public relations firm. He crept into my bedroom, moving with the erratic, silent tension of a seasoned thief. He ignored the shattered glass and bypassed his paralyzed father. Julian locked his eyes on my wooden desk. He saw my closed laptop. Resting right beside it was a heavy silver external hard drive. It was encased in brushed aluminum and secured with a biometric fingerprint scanner. Julian processed the hardware through the lens of his own ignorance. He believed I was a local freelance accountant taking cash under the table. He assumed that heavy encrypted drive contained my entire professional livelihood. He thought it held the private tax ledgers, the banking routing numbers, and the proprietary client lists of dozens of wealthy local businesses. In the corporate underworld, verified financial data is a highly liquid asset. He did not ask for a loan. He did not beg for salvation. He snatched the silver drive from the desk, slipping it into the inner pocket of his tailored linen shirt. He retreated into the shadows of the hallway and sprinted down the back staircase. Julian drove his least luxury coupe through the freezing Thanksgiving night, breaking multiple traffic laws as he sped toward the downtown commercial district. He gripped the steering wheel, his heart hammering against his ribs. The dashboard clock glowed red, indicating he had less than 2 hours before the shadow lenders initiated the corporate seizure. He arrived at an exclusive underground nightclub located in the basement of a converted warehouse. The venue catered to the elite tiers of the tech and logistics sector, offering a sanctuary of thumping bass, premium spirits, and discreet networking. Julian bypassed the long line outside, slipping the head bouncer a $100 bill to gain immediate entry into the VIP lounge. The air inside was thick with imported smoke and the rhythmic pulse of heavy electronic music. Julian scanned the dimly lit leather booths, searching for his target. He found him sitting in a secluded corner surrounded by private security personnel. Trent operated as the chief executive officer of a rival logistics conglomerate. Julian had met him months prior at a venture capital networking brunch. Trent was notorious for his ruthless acquisition strategies and his willingness to cross ethical boundaries to secure market dominance. Julian pushed past a cocktail waitress and slid into the leather booth across from Trent. The older executive frowned, annoyed by the sudden intrusion. He gestured for his security team to intervene, but Julian raised a hand, signaling he possessed something of immense value. Julian reached into his shirt and placed the heavy silver hard drive onto the glass table. The brushed aluminum caught the neon lights of the lounge. Trent waved his security guards back and leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He looked at the drive and then at Julian, evaluating the frantic sweat coating the younger man's face. "I have the ultimate proprietary ledger," Julian said, raising his voice to cut through the heavy bass of the club. "My sister operates a boutique accounting firm handling the private finances of the wealthiest private contractors in the state. This drive contains her unencrypted client database. It holds their tax vulnerabilities, their offshore routing preferences, and their supply chain contacts." Julian leaned closer, desperate to close the transaction. "With this data, you can undercut every single competitor in your sector." Julian pitched, his voice cracking with adrenaline. "You can absorb her entire client roster by Monday morning. I am offering you a total market monopoly." Trent stared at the silver drive, his eyes narrowing as he calculated the potential revenue. He asked Julian what price he demanded for the corporate espionage. "I need $50,000, Julian answered, swallowing hard. "I need it wired to a specific holding account right now. No negotiations, no delays. Wire the funds and the drive is yours." Julian sat in the dim nightclub, believing he had just executed a masterful stroke of corporate theft. He thought he was selling my local accounting clients to a ruthless executive to save his own life. He had no idea what was actually contained within that brushed aluminum casing. He did not know he was holding a digital bomb designed to detonate the moment it connected to a foreign server. Trent looked at the brushed aluminum hard drive resting on the glass table. The heavy bass of the underground club vibrated through the plush leather seating. Julian sat across from him, wiping a thin layer of sweat from his forehead. The dashboard clock on his leased coupe read 10:30 when he parked in the alley. He had less than 90 minutes to wire $50,000 to the mezzanine fund before the shadow lenders liquidated his wife's public relations agency. Trent did not reach for his checkbook. He reached into his leather briefcase and extracted a sleek black laptop. Trust in the corporate underworld is a liability. Verification is the only valid currency. Miles away in my quiet suburban bedroom, I noticed the empty space on my wooden desk. The biometric hard drive was missing. I did not panic. I did not rush downstairs to interrogate my ruined parents. I simply closed my laptop and poured a glass of mineral water. Julian assumed the drive contained the private tax ledgers and social security numbers of local bakery owners. He evaluated my entire existence through the narrow lens of his own arrogance. I was not a local freelance accountant taking cash under the table. The digital files secured inside that aluminum casing represented the core source code of a proprietary logistics technology firm I founded 4 years ago. The software optimized global shipping routes, utilizing advanced predictive modeling and artificial intelligence. A major international logistics conglomerate was currently finalizing a clandestine acquisition of my company for a 9-figure valuation. To protect a digital asset of that magnitude, standard encryption is insufficient. I engineered a proactive defense mechanism designed to neutralize industrial espionage. The hard drive featured a geo-locked security protocol. If the device was connected to a terminal outside of a pre-authorized coordinate grid, the hardware assumed a hostile corporate capture event. It did not merely lock the data behind a password prompt. It executed a lethal countermeasure to protect the intellectual property. Inside the dimly lit VIP lounge, Trent plugged the silver drive into the data port of his laptop. He typed a rapid sequence of commands preparing to clone the accounting databases Julian promised. He intended to absorb the fictional client roster, find their tax vulnerabilities, and dominate the local market. The screen illuminated his face with a cold blue glow. He opened his secure corporate network, linking his laptop directly to the primary servers of his logistics conglomerate to facilitate a seamless data transfer. He initiated the handshake protocol. The hardware verified its global positioning coordinates using an internal cellular ping. It registered the location as an unauthorized underground warehouse miles away from my secure office server. The defensive algorithm engaged instantly. Trent watched the blue screen flicker and turn a stark, unforgiving crimson. The progress bar did not indicate a download. A command prompt window opened, flooding the screen with cascading lines of white code. The drive unleashed a localized ransomware payload. The digital weapon traveled through the braided data cable, bypassed his laptop firewalls, and surged upward through the active network connection. It targeted the central nervous system of his logistics empire. Trent tapped the keyboard, attempting to sever the connection and initiate a manual override. The keys yielded zero response. The operating system was locked in terminal paralysis. His smartphone vibrated violently against the glass table. He answered the call, placing the device on speaker. His chief technology officer shouted through the small speaker, struggling to be heard over the thumping club music. The executive reported a catastrophic system failure occurring at their downtown headquarters. The active shipping manifest, the client routing data, and the financial ledgers of the entire conglomerate were wiping themselves from the internal servers. The digital architecture of his company was burning to the ground in real time. Delivery trucks across the country would be stranded by morning. Millions of dollars in active contracts were vaporizing. Trent stared at the red screen, his eyes wide with a mixture of horror and mounting fury. He severed the call and pulled the data cable from the port, but the containment effort was futile. The payload had already executed its primary objective. He looked across the table at Julian. The desperate startup entrepreneur sat frozen, holding his breath, expecting a wire transfer confirmation. Julian possessed no technical expertise. He did not understand the crimson screen or the frantic phone call. He leaned forward, asking if the $50,000 was ready to be transferred to his designated account. Trent did not answer the question. He raised a single hand, snapping his fingers. The three private security contractors standing near the edge of the booth moved with synchronized, brutal efficiency. They grabbed Julian by the shoulders, pulling him out of the leather seating. They slammed him face down onto the glass table, pinning his arms painfully behind his back. Julian gasped, struggling against the overwhelming physical force. He shouted in confusion, claiming there must be a technical error with the tax files and begging them to check the data again. Trent stood up, buttoning his tailored suit jacket. He leaned over the table, placing his face inches from Julian. He spoke in a low, dangerous register, cutting through the ambient noise of the heavy bass. "You did not hand me an accounting ledger," Trent stated, his voice dripping with pure venom. "You handed me a digital bomb. You just orchestrated a direct cyber attack against my corporate infrastructure. You wiped my active server grid and paralyzed my daily operations." Julian shook his head frantically, his cheek pressed against the cold glass surface. He begged for an explanation, swearing he only took the drive from his sister's suburban bedroom. He pleaded for the $50,000, citing his impending midnight deadline with the shadow lenders. He promised to fix whatever computer glitch caused the error. Trent laughed, a cold, hollow sound lacking any trace of amusement. "You are not getting a single dime," Trent promised, stepping away from the table. "You are getting a federal lawsuit. I am dispatching my corporate legal team first thing Monday morning. I am filing a civil suit against you for $5 million, citing industrial espionage and intentional corporate sabotage. I will freeze whatever miserable assets you have left. I will drag you through a decade of litigation until you are bankrupt and rotting in a jail cell." The security guards hauled Julian to his feet, dragging him backward toward the rear service exit of the nightclub. He kicked and pleaded, but his protests were swallowed by the loud music. The heavy steel door was shoved open, and Julian was tossed into the freezing alleyway. He landed hard on the damp concrete, scraping his hands and tearing his expensive linen shirt. The steel door slammed shut, locking from the inside. Julian lay there shivering in the cold night air, staring at the damp brick walls. The midnight deadline loomed less than an hour away. The shadow lenders were already preparing their asset recovery teams to seize his wife's public relations firm. He had attempted to steal his way out of a crushing debt. Instead, he had just triggered a catastrophic cyber event and buried himself under a $5 million lawsuit from a ruthless corporate adversary. He possessed no money, no leverage, and nowhere left to run. Back at the suburban estate, Richard and Helen sat in the quiet living room, entirely unaware that their golden child was drowning in an ocean of legal ruin. The illusion of their aristocratic family was disintegrating hour by hour, and the true architect of their downfall had not even left her bedroom. The automated alert from the wealth management firm arrived in Richard's inbox just past midnight. It was a standard compliance notification generated by the federal banking algorithms. The text informed my father that his generational trust fund was locked under an active federal investigation. The $10 million he handed to Julian was trapped in a digital void. Faced with impending financial ruin, Richard and Beverly did not experience a moment of clarity. Cognitive dissonance acts as a heavy shield against accountability. Instead of accepting that their golden son-in-law was a corporate spy who stole their life savings, they redirected their terror toward me. They convinced themselves that I had manipulated the federal banking algorithms out of pure vindictive jealousy. They believed Julian was an innocent victim of my ruthless corporate warfare. They needed to stop my investigation, unfreeze the accounts, and save the pristine high society wedding they had meticulously planned for Chloe. They lacked the leverage to fight me in a boardroom. They lacked the liquid capital to hire a premium defense attorney. Forced into a corner, my parents retreated to a sinister, archaic strategy. If they could not defeat me professionally, they decided to erase my legal autonomy. Richard understood the mechanics of a legal conservatorship. He knew that if a primary family member could prove a relative was mentally incompetent or a severe danger to themselves, the court would grant an emergency power of attorney. A designated conservator gains total control over the personal finances, medical decisions, and corporate assets of the ward. Richard reasoned that if he could secure a psychiatric hold, he could legally step into my role as chairman of Aura Hospitality. He could withdraw the federal fraud accusations against Julian, authorize the release of the frozen funds, and send me to a secluded psychiatric facility until the wedding was over. To execute this medical coup, Richard required a willing physician. He reached out to Dr. Eris Thorne, a high society concierge physician who catered to the elite families of Connecticut. Dr. Thorne possessed a pristine medical license but harbored a severe undisclosed gambling debt. He was a man who traded ethical boundaries for cash envelopes. At 2:00 in the morning, the security perimeter of my Manhattan penthouse registered a breach at the private elevator. My parents retained an emergency biometric access code from the previous owner. They assumed I was asleep, exhausted from the gala. They stepped into the dark foyer of my residence, moving with cautious, hurried steps. Dr. Thorne followed close behind them, carrying a black leather medical bag containing the necessary psychiatric evaluation forms. I was not asleep. I sat in a high-backed leather armchair in the center of the sunken living room. The penthouse was shrouded in darkness, illuminated only by the ambient glow of the city skyline filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. I wore a dark silk robe holding a glass of mineral water. I breathed slowly, watching the shadows of my family stretch across the imported hardwood floor. Richard guided the physician toward the marble kitchen island. They conversed in low, hushed whispers, unaware that the acoustics of the open-concept penthouse amplified every syllable. Richard explained the parameters of their fabricated narrative. He instructed Dr. Thorne to sign a medical affidavit claiming I had suffered a severe schizophrenic break. Richard detailed a fictitious history of my paranoia, erratic behavior, and severe delusions of grandeur. He claimed my hostile takeover of the hotel conglomerate was the resulting action of a fractured mind. Beverly stood beside her husband, nodding in agreement. She added layers to the lie, describing me as unhinged and a physical threat to the family. Dr. Thorne listened to the elaborate fiction. He set his leather bag on the marble counter and unzipped the main compartment. He extracted a stack of legal medical documents bearing the official seal of the State Health Department. "This is an involuntary 72-hour psychiatric commitment," Dr. Thorne whispered, tapping a silver pen against the paperwork. "Falsifying this evaluation carries severe criminal penalties. If the hospital board reviews her mental state and finds no evidence of schizophrenia, They will revoke my medical license. I am taking on a catastrophic level of professional risk. Richard did not argue. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored trench coat. Since his bank accounts were frozen by the federal government, he had resorted to physical assets. He pulled out a thick velvet pouch. He untied the silk drawstrings and emptied the contents onto the marble island. A collection of Beverly's vintage heirloom jewelry cascaded onto the stone surface. Diamond tennis bracelets, platinum rings, and a heavy emerald necklace sparkled in the dim light. It was the last remaining fraction of their untraceable generational wealth. "Take it," Richard urged, his voice trembling with desperate urgency. "There is easily $200,000 in unrecorded stones sitting right there. Sign the involuntary commitment papers. Once I take control of her corporate assets tomorrow morning, I will wire another $500,000 to your offshore account. We just need her incapacitated immediately." Dr. Thorne stared at the pile of diamonds. The allure of erasing his gambling debt overrode his medical oath. He picked up the silver pen and uncapped it. He leaned over the marble island, pressing the ink against the signature line of the psychiatric affidavit. I placed my glass of mineral water on the side table. The soft clink of the crystal echoed in the quiet room. Dr. Thorne froze. Richard and Beverly spun around, peering into the darkness of the sunken living room. "You should read the corporate bylaws before you attempt a medical coup, Richard," I said, my voice projecting a calm, lethal authority. Aura Hospitality requires 3 independent board-appointed psychiatrists to verify any claim of executive incompetence. A single signature from a compromised concierge doctor will not grant you access to my shares. I pressed a button on the smart home interface integrated into the armrest of my chair. The ambient lighting of the penthouse activated instantly. Bright recessed bulbs flooded the kitchen and living room with harsh clinical light. Richard shielded his eyes, taking a sudden step back from the marble island. Beverly let out a sharp gasp, clutching her trench coat around her shoulders. Dr. Thorne dropped his silver pen, his face turning the color of wet ash. I stood up and walked slowly toward the kitchen. I did not raise my voice or display any trace of the erratic behavior they had just described. I projected the cold, unyielding stability of a woman who held absolute control over her environment. "You broke into my residence in the middle of the night to strip away my legal autonomy," I stated, stopping a few feet away from the island. "You intended to drug me, lock me in a psychiatric ward, and steal my company just to save a man who actively despises you. The sheer magnitude of your delusion is genuinely fascinating." Richard recovered from his initial shock. He puffed out his chest, attempting to summon his fading patriarchal authority. He pointed a finger at me, his face flushing red with desperate anger. "You are sick, Claire," he declared, raising his voice to dominate the room. "You ruined your sister's engagement. You destroyed Julian's career. You froze our bank accounts. We are doing this for your own good." He looked at the physician, urging him to finish signing the document, but Dr. Thorne was staring at the ceiling. I followed his gaze, smiling faintly. "When I purchased this penthouse, I upgraded the internal security perimeter," I explained, tracing the edge of the marble counter. "I installed high-definition smart home cameras inside the recessed lighting fixtures. They feature integrated audio recording and direct cloud synchronization." The physician understood the technological reality immediately. The color drained from his face as he realized his entire career was evaporating. I activated the system the moment the elevator doors opened. I continued, my tone dropping to a quiet, lethal register. "The servers currently hold a crystal-clear recording of you, Richard, dictating a fabricated medical diagnosis. They captured Beverly confirming the lie. And most importantly, the cameras recorded Dr. Thorne accepting a pile of untraceable diamonds in exchange for a fraudulent psychiatric hold." Dr. Thorne took a stumbling step backward. He looked at the jewelry on the counter and then at the glowing lenses hidden in the ceiling fixtures. He knew the footage was a guaranteed prison sentence for medical fraud and bribery. "You just purchased a felony, Richard," I informed my father. Dr. Thorne did not wait for this conversation to conclude. He abandoned his black leather bag. He abandoned the diamonds and the psychiatric forms. The disgraced physician turned on his heel and sprinted toward the private elevator, smashing the call button with a trembling fist. He fled the penthouse, leaving his wealthy clients to face the consequences of their failed ambush. Richard stared at the abandoned medical documents. The brilliant legal loophole he thought would save his family had just transformed into an ironclad extortion trap. He slowly raised his eyes to meet mine. The arrogance melted away, leaving a cornered, terrified man standing in my kitchen. He realized I held the video file that could send both him and his wife to a federal penitentiary for conspiracy and bribery. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words died in his throat. The balance of power had permanently shifted and the real negotiation was about to begin. Dr. Thorne slammed his hand against the call button of the private elevator. The polished steel doors remained firmly shut. I had overridden the access panel from my smart home terminal the moment he tried to run. He turned around, his chest heaving with frantic, shallow breaths. I walked across the sunken living room holding a sleek silver tablet. I stopped a few feet away from him and turned the screen around so he could view the display. The high-definition footage played in perfect clarity. The sensitive microphones captured his exact voice discussing the fake schizophrenia diagnosis and negotiating the price of his medical ethics. I explained the legal reality to him in a quiet, steady tone. I cited the specific federal statutes for medical fraud, criminal conspiracy, and accepting bribes to falsify psychiatric holds. I detailed how the state medical board would not just strip his medical license, but refer him to the Department of Justice for immediate prosecution. I noted that white-collar prisons are unforgiving to disgraced physicians who trade their medical oaths for unrecorded jewelry. I showed him the specific digital frame capturing his hand hovering over the involuntary commitment paperwork. The evidence was irrefutable. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and hollow. His pristine reputation built over decades of catering to the Connecticut elite was dissolving before his eyes. He reached into his coat pocket with trembling fingers. He pulled out the heavy velvet pouch of vintage diamonds Richard had just handed him and placed it carefully on the marble console table. He stammered a long string of apologies, swearing he would surrender his practice and never contact my family again. I tapped the tablet, restoring power to the elevator. The doors slid open and the disgraced physician practically fell into the cabin, fleeing the building like a hunted animal. Richard and Beverly stood frozen near the kitchen island. They watched their final desperate strategy evaporate into the cold Manhattan night. The medical coup failed. The conservatorship gambit imploded. They were left stranded in the penthouse of the daughter they had just tried to lock inside a psychiatric ward. Richard opened his mouth, attempting to formulate another lie or perhaps beg for mercy, but the severe expression on my face silenced him. I did not raise my voice or offer an emotional monologue about their lifelong betrayal. I simply delivered the financial verdict. I informed them that the corporate umbrella shielding their remaining lifestyle expenses was officially terminated. I pulled up my administrative dashboard on the tablet and executed a series of targeted cancellations. I revoked the automated payments for their estate utilities, their premium health insurance policies, and the exclusive country club memberships they cherished above all else. I deactivated the emergency grocery credit lines linked to my subsidiary accounts. I informed them that the maintenance staff at their foreclosed mansion would arrive at dawn to change the locks and secure the perimeter on behalf of my shadow firm, Vanguard Equity. They had tried to steal my legal autonomy to save a criminal. In return, I stripped away the last remaining threads of their high society existence, reducing them to destitution. I pressed the intercom button on my desk and instructed the lobby security team to escort 2 trespassers out of the building. My parents walked toward the elevator, their heads bowed, carrying the crushing weight of their own ruin. They stepped out into the freezing city streets with no access to cash, no social standing, and a locked home waiting for them. The empire they thought they controlled was dust. While my parents faced the harsh reality of poverty, a different kind of betrayal unfolded across the city. Julian sat in his darkened luxury apartment, consumed by the catastrophic failure of his corporate espionage. He stared blankly at a muted television, his mind paralyzed by the impending federal indictments and the lethal threats from the apex shadow investors. He had consumed half a bottle of expensive bourbon, trying to numb the reality of his destroyed career. He slumped on the velvet sofa, his breathing shallow and uneven. He was a defeated man possessing no remaining strategic value. Chloe observed him from the doorway of the master bedroom. She did not feel a shred of empathy for her new husband. She did not mourn the loss of his prestige or fear for his safety. Her mind operated on a strict currency of vanity and self-preservation. She pulled out her smartphone, checking her social media analytics. The lucrative corporate sponsorships for her upcoming high society wedding were already evaporating as blind items regarding Julian committing federal crimes began circulating through the elite social networks. Her follower count was hemorrhaging. She realized the lavish billionaire lifestyle she had built her influencer brand around was a sinking ship. She refused to drown with a man who could no longer fund her designer wardrobe or elevate her social standing. Chloe walked to the mahogany desk where Julian kept his secondary administrative laptop. She knew he maintained a small hidden startup fund intended for minor venture capital investments. It was a fraction of his former wealth, but it was enough to secure her a first-class ticket to Europe and a few months of luxury hotel stays, while she rebranded her digital persona. She opened the laptop utilizing the passcode she had memorized weeks ago. Her manicured fingers moved rapidly across the keyboard. First, she accessed a legal template database and drafted a rapid annulment petition. She intended to file the paperwork claiming fraud to sever their recent secret courthouse marriage before the federal authorities could seize her personal assets. She printed the document and shoved it into her designer handbag. Then she navigated to the hidden venture capital ledger. The screen displayed a balance of $500,000. It was a pathetic sum compared to the $10 million he had tried to steal, but it was liquid and ready to move. Chloe set up a secure routing channel, linking the remaining capital to an anonymous digital wallet she controlled. She did not understand the intricate architecture of offshore finance or the severe risks attached to dark money. She only cared about securing her escape fund. She highlighted the entire $500,000 balance and clicked the execute command. The progress bar filled rapidly, pushing the funds through the encrypted nodes. She smiled, believing she had successfully outsmarted both her criminal husband and her ruthless sister. But Chloe lacked the technical foresight to recognize a financial tripwire. That specific startup account was not a standard commercial checking ledger. It was the original collateral account Julian had used to secure his initial illicit loans from the Apex shadow investors. The balance was contractually mandated to remain untouched as a show of good faith to the ruthless syndicate. By initiating a rapid total withdrawal, Chloe did not just drain the account. She triggered a default alert embedded deep within the routing software. The transaction bypassed the standard banking notifications entirely. An automated distress signal was dispatched directly to the underground credit syndicate monitoring the funds. These were not traditional debt collectors armed with clipboards and court orders. They were shadow operatives who specialized in silent lethal asset recovery. The laptop screen flashed a sharp yellow warning detailing a critical breach of collateral terms. Chloe frowned, staring at the cryptic error code. She assumed it was a standard banking delay and tapped the keyboard in frustration. She did not realize she had just signaled her exact location to a syndicate that viewed financial default as an act of war. The heavy silence of the luxury apartment was suddenly broken by the sound of the private elevator engaging in the hallway outside. Julian was too intoxicated to notice the mechanical hum, but Chloe heard the distinct metallic chime. The elevator doors opened. The heavy, synchronized footsteps of professional enforcers echoed through the marble corridor, marching with terrifying purpose directly toward their front door. The freezing autumn rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Manhattan duplex penthouse. It was late November. Outside the luxury high-rise, the city observed Thanksgiving night. It was a holiday traditionally defined by warmth, familial gratitude, and roasted dinners shared around crowded tables. Inside Julian's opulent residence, the atmosphere mirrored the interior of a concrete mausoleum. The sprawling apartment was stripped of any festive spirit, replacing the holiday cheer with the suffocating weight of impending federal indictments and financial ruin. Richard and Beverly sat huddled on a curved velvet sofa in the center of the living room. They had arrived hours earlier, dragging a few hastily packed canvas suitcases across the polished marble floors. Evicted from their pristine Connecticut estate by my foreclosure notice, they had nowhere else to turn. Their high society friends had abandoned them, blocking their phone numbers to avoid the stench of the unfolding scandal. Stripped of their generational wealth and their country club dignity, my parents had crawled to the only shelter remaining. They sought refuge with the very man who had orchestrated their total destruction. Julian was a hollow ghost of the arrogant executive who had mocked me at the engagement party just weeks ago. He sat on a low leather ottoman, staring blankly at the dark television screen. He wore a rumpled white dress shirt unbuttoned at the collar, his designer tie discarded on the floor. He gripped an empty crystal tumbler, his knuckles white, his breathing shallow and erratic. He knew the federal algorithms had frozen his accounts. He knew the Apex shadow investors were hunting him for paralyzing their global network. He was trapped in a gilded cage, waiting for the inevitable execution of his career and his freedom. In the adjoining master study, my sister Chloe sat hunched over his secondary laptop. Her designer silk blouse was wrinkled and her pristine makeup was smudged. She typed frantically, driven by a feral instinct for self-preservation. She had just initiated the transfer of his hidden $500,000 startup fund into her anonymous digital wallet. She believed she was executing a flawless escape, maneuvering around both the federal authorities and her ruined groom. She stared at the loading bar on the screen, waiting for the green confirmation checkmark. Instead, the display flashed a sharp, aggressive yellow. A cryptic error code materialized, warning of a critical collateral breach. Chloe frowned, her manicured fingers hovering over the trackpad. She assumed it was a standard banking delay. She did not comprehend the intricate architecture of offshore mezzanine funds. She did not realize that the startup account was the primary collateral for Julian's illicit shadow loans. By attempting to drain the ledger, she had tripped a silent digital alarm wired directly to a ruthless credit syndicate. The mechanical chime of the private elevator echoed through the silent penthouse. Julian flinched, dropping his empty crystal tumbler. The glass bounced against the thick wool rug. Richard and Beverly sat up straight, their eyes darting toward the heavy mahogany front door. Chloe froze in the study, staring at the yellow error screen as the reality of her action began to solidify into pure terror. I stood on the glass landing of the spiral staircase, surveying the scene unfolding below me. I had not arrived with my parents. I had utilized the master biometric access codes granted to the primary lien holder of the property. When Julian secured the mortgage for this duplex penthouse, he bypassed traditional commercial banks, relying on a high-interest mezzanine debt structure to fund his lavish lifestyle. Mezzanine funds operate in the gray spaces of corporate finance, utilizing aggressive collateral clauses that grant the lender immediate ownership rights upon default. 3 months ago, my shadow firm Vanguard Equity quietly purchased the debt portfolio containing the deed to this exact residence. I owned the floor beneath their feet. I had arrived to observe the collapse of their fragile sanctuary. Heavy synchronized footsteps marched down the marble hallway outside the penthouse. These were not the hesitant steps of a concierge or the measured pace of federal agents. The cadence was rigid, forceful, and disciplined. It was the sound of professional enforcers arriving to collect a debt. A thunderous pounding struck the heavy mahogany door. The impact shook the doorframe, echoing through the cavernous living room like a physical blow. Julian let out a pathetic, choked gasp. His survival instinct abandoned all logic and dignity. He scrambled backward off the leather ottoman, his polished shoes slipping against the wool rug. He crawled behind the velvet sofa, pressing his back against the cushions. He reached out and grabbed the fabric of Beverly's trench coat, pulling his mother-in-law in front of him, using an elderly woman as a human shield against the impending violence. Beverly sat paralyzed, her eyes wide with unadulterated fear, unable to process the cowardice of the man she had once championed. Richard shrank into the corner of the sofa, gripping the armrest, his patriarchal authority entirely erased by the sound of the pounding fist. In the study, Chloe slammed the laptop shut. Her breath hitched in her throat as she realized the digital error code had summoned physical predators. She backed away from the desk, pressing herself into the shadows, her hands covering her mouth to muffle her frantic hyperventilation. Another heavy strike hit the door, followed by a low, grating voice demanding immediate entry. The voice promised that the reinforced mahogany would not hold them back for more than 60 seconds. No one in the living room dared to move. They remained frozen, trapped in a paralyzing web of their own deceit and arrogance. I adjusted the cuffs of my dark wool trench coat. I descended the glass spiral staircase, my leather boots clicking softly against the transparent treads. The steady, rhythmic sound of my descent cut through the heavy, panicked silence of the penthouse. Julian peeked over the edge of the velvet sofa, his eyes widening in shock, recognizing my presence. He looked at me with a mixture of confusion and sheer terror, unable to fathom why I was walking toward the door instead of calling the police. I stepped off the staircase and walked across the living room. I bypassed Richard, who was trembling uncontrollably. I walked past Beverly and the cowering groom. I did not offer them a single word of comfort or explanation. I approached the entryway, reaching out with a steady gloved hand to grip the heavy brass deadbolt. I turned the lock. The metal mechanism clicked loudly in the quiet foyer. I unlatched the handle and pulled the heavy mahogany door inward. A man stood in the hallway, blocking the threshold. He wore a pristine charcoal suit that stretched tightly over a broad, muscular frame. His posture was rigid, projecting the cold, calculated intent of a seasoned debt collector. A jagged scar ran along his jawline, hinting at a history of violent negotiations. He held a thick leather dossier in his left hand, his right hand resting casually near the inner lapel of his tailored jacket. He leaned forward, prepared to intimidate a terrified executive into surrendering his assets. The enforcer locked eyes with me. The visual processing took a fraction of a second. The calculated intimidation evaporated from his features, replaced by sudden, stark recognition. The lethal tension in his shoulders dropped. He immediately withdrew his hand from his jacket, stepping backward into the hallway to create a respectful distance. He straightened his posture, pulling the edges of his charcoal suit jacket together. The enforcer bowed his head, executing a gesture of profound, unyielding reverence. Good evening, Madam Chairman. He stated, his voice losing its grating edge, transitioning into a tone of quiet professional deference. I apologize for the disruption on a holiday. The living room behind me plunged into a silence so profound it felt like a vacuum. Julian stopped breathing, his mind fracturing as he attempted to comprehend the interaction. Richard and Beverly stared at the open doorway, their worldview shattering into useless, jagged pieces. The ruthless shadow syndicate, the loan sharks hunting Julian for default, were currently bowing to their eldest daughter. I stepped aside, gesturing for the enforcer to enter the foyer. He stepped across the threshold, keeping his eyes respectfully lowered. I turned to face my trembling family. Mezzanine debt funds provide immense liquidity to executives who lack the legal collateral for traditional bank loans. I explained, my voice echoing in the quiet penthouse. But shadow syndicates require deep capital reserves to operate. Last year, this specific fund faced a severe liquidity crisis under the threat of a federal audit. A private equity holding company stepped in, assuming control of their operational debt and acquiring their primary portfolios. I looked directly at Julian, watching the blood drain entirely from his face. Vanguard Equity owns the holding company, I stated, delivering the final crushing blow to his reality. You did not just borrow money from a random underground syndicate, Julian. You borrowed money from my ledger. I am your ultimate creditor. The enforcer stepped forward, opening the thick leather dossier. He did not look at Julian. He turned his attention toward the dark study where Chloe stood trembling in the shadows. The enforcer extracted a single printed document detailing a real-time routing trace. Madam Chairman, the enforcer announced, his voice carrying a lethal professional clarity. 3 minutes ago, an unauthorized wire transfer was initiated from the primary collateral account linked to this property. The protocol dictates that any attempt to siphon secure syndicate collateral constitutes a direct act of financial theft. The enforcer pointed a gloved finger directly at my sister. The routing destination traces to an anonymous digital wallet controlled by that woman, the enforcer continued. By attempting to steal syndicate capital, she has forged a direct personal liability with the fund. She owes the principal balance of $500,000 effective immediately. Chloe let out a sharp, terrified whimper, her knees buckling as she slid down the wall of the study. She had tried to steal a fraction of Julian's hidden wealth to fund her escape. Instead, she had just hardwired her own identity to a ruthless credit syndicate. She was no longer just a tax evader facing an IRS audit. She was a marked debtor to the mob, and the woman holding the ledger was the sister she had spent her entire life humiliating. The enforcer stood in the foyer with his hands clasped, resting the thick leather dossier against his charcoal suit. He did not blink. He did not offer any further explanation to the trembling woman in the dark study. He waited for my command. The silence in the duplex penthouse grew heavy, pressing against the chest of every person in the room. Chloe remained on the floor, her back pressed against the wall, her chest to heave with rapid, erratic breaths. She stared at the enforcer and then shifted her gaze to me. The intricate architecture of her high society delusions crumbled into dust. She had spent her entire adult life curating an image of untouchable wealth, looking down on anyone who did not wear the correct designer labels. Now she was sitting on the floor of a foreclosed apartment owing $500,000 to a shadow credit syndicate controlled by her older sister. Richard and Beverly did not move from the velvet sofa. My father stared at his trembling hands, his mind fracturing under the weight of this new paradigm. They had assumed my corporate acquisition of Aura Hospitality was a stroke of luck, or perhaps a temporary legal maneuver. They never comprehended the true depth of my financial infrastructure. They did not understand that I did not just buy hotel chains. I operated a diversified holding company that specialized in acquiring distressed assets and predatory debt portfolios. I walked past the enforcer, stepping onto the wool rug in the center of the living room. I looked down at Julian. He was still cowering behind my mother, gripping the fabric of her trench coat. The Ivy League prodigy, the man who stood under a crystal chandelier and labeled me a failure, was reduced to a pathetic shell of a human being. You built a very convincing persona, Julian, I said, my voice steady and quiet. You wore bespoke suits. You leased a duplex penthouse in a premier zip code. You handed my sister a platinum credit card and told her to buy whatever she wanted, but none of it belonged to you. Julian opened his mouth, his jaw working, but no sound emerged. His eyes darted between the enforcer in the hallway and the cold expression on my face. Traditional commercial banks require tangible collateral for multi-million-dollar mortgages, I explained, pacing slowly across the living room. They require verified income streams and audited tax returns. You lacked both because your primary income relied on corporate espionage and offshore embezzlement. To fund your luxury lifestyle, you turn to a mezzanine credit fund. I gestured toward the enforcer standing in the doorway. Mezzanine funds provide immense liquidity, but they operate on aggressive acceleration clauses. I continued outlining the exact legal trap that now held him captive. They secure their loans against future unearned equity and personal assets. 6 months ago, that specific fund overextended its capital reserves. My private equity firm Vanguard Equity absorbed their operational debt. We bought their entire ledger at a steep discount. Julian swallowed hard, a bead of cold sweat tracing a path down his bruised jawline. He began to understand the inescapable mathematics of his situation. That means every single time you swiped your credit card to buy expensive champagne, you were spending my capital, I informed him. When you paid the lease on this penthouse, you were sending the interest payments to my corporate accounts. You financed your entire arrogant existence using the wealth of the woman you despised. I have owned you since the day you proposed to my sister. I turned my attention to Chloe. She was weeping silently, tears ruining her pristine makeup. The initial loan principal was $5 million, I stated, directing the financial reality toward both of them. But standard mezzanine contracts contain strict penalty protocols for fraudulent transfers. By attempting to route the remaining $500,000 into an anonymous digital wallet, Chloe triggered the default acceleration clause. The contract mandates an immediate penalty interest application of 200% on the remaining balance. Julian let out a ragged, desperate gasp. His analytical mind processed the figures instantly. He did not just owe the remaining $500,000. The penalty clause quadrupled his debt in a matter of seconds. You owe me $2 million effective immediately. I declared, the sum hanging in the cold air of the penthouse. And thanks to the automated federal algorithms triggered by your offshore wire attempt, you possess zero liquid capital. Your accounts are frozen. Your Cayman shell company is red flagged. You have no assets to liquidate. The finality of the statement broke the last remaining thread of Julian's sanity. The polished facade of the corporate spy shattered, leaving behind a cornered, frantic animal. He was trapped in a foreclosed penthouse, hunted by the SEC, targeted by the apex shadow investors, and legally indebted to a sister-in-law who held the power to destroy him with a single phone call. His breathing turned into rapid, shallow hyperventilation. His eyes darted around the room, searching for an exit. The private elevator was blocked by the enforcer. The windows offered a 50-story drop to the Manhattan pavement. But on the marble console table near the entryway sat a single silver key fob. It belonged to the luxury Porsche sports car Chloe had leased just weeks prior, using the credit lines he could no longer access. Survival instinct overrode all logical reasoning. Julian did not formulate a cohesive plan. He only knew he had to escape the physical perimeter of the penthouse before the enforcer decided to collect the debt in blood. Julian released his grip on Beverly's trench coat. He lunged forward, scrambling off the wool rug with a sudden burst of adrenaline-fueled speed. He bypassed the velvet sofa, knocking a crystal vase off a side table. The glass shattered against the marble floor, echoing like a gunshot. Richard shouted in surprise, pulling his legs up to avoid the flying shards. Julian sprinted toward the entryway. The enforcer in the charcoal suit shifted his weight, preparing to intercept the fleeing debtor. I raised my right hand a fraction of an inch, signaling the enforcer to stand down. The professional debt collector recognized the subtle command immediately. He stepped backward, clearing the threshold and allowing the desperate man an unobstructed path to the exit. I had no intention of engaging in a physical altercation inside my newly acquired property. A man running blind on pure panic is his own worst enemy. Julian grabbed the silver key fob off the console table. He did not wait for the private elevator. He slammed his shoulder into the heavy metal door leading to the emergency stairwell. The door banged open, bouncing against the concrete wall. Julian disappeared into the cold, echoing stairwell, his leather shoes slapping frantically against the steel grates as he descended toward the subterranean parking garage. I walked over to the console table and picked up my encrypted tablet. I tapped a command accessing the closed-circuit security cameras, monitoring the parking levels of the high-rise building. I held the screen up so the enforcer and my trembling family could witness the final act of a ruined man. Down in the concrete cavern of the parking garage, the fluorescent lights flickered, casting long, distorted shadows across the rows of luxury vehicles. Julian burst through the stairwell door, his chest heaving. He hammered the unlock button on the key fob. The sleek black Porsche chirped, its headlights flashing in the dim garage. Julian threw himself into the driver's seat, pulling the heavy door shut. His hands shook violently as he gripped the leather steering wheel. He pressed the ignition button. The high-performance engine roared to life, a deep, guttural sound that echoed off the concrete pillars. He did not bother to fasten his seatbelt. He threw the transmission into drive. His mind clouded by sheer terror and an overwhelming surge of adrenaline. He intended to speed out of the garage merge onto the interstate and flee the state before the federal authorities could issue a formal arrest warrant. He believed the speed of the sports car could outrun the consequences of his actions. He slammed his foot down on the pedal. The Porsche possessed a highly sensitive acceleration system designed for precise track driving. Julian was a man accustomed to riding in chauffeured town cars, not handling raw mechanical torque in a confined space. In his blind panic, he applied far too much pressure to the throttle. The rear tires broke traction, instantly spinning wildly against the smooth, polished concrete of the parking garage floor. A thick cloud of white smoke erupted from the wheel wells, filling the air with the sharp, acrid stench of burning rubber. The sports car launched forward with terrifying velocity, operating entirely out of his control. Julian wrenched the steering wheel to the right, attempting to navigate the sharp turn leading to the exit ramp. His erratic movement overcorrected the steering angle. The heavy vehicle broke loose, entering a violent, uncontrolled slide across the driving lane. At the base of the exit ramp stood the primary security barrier of the luxury building. It was a reinforced steel gate engineered specifically to prevent unauthorized vehicle intrusion. The thick metal bars were anchored deep into the concrete foundation. Julian realized his trajectory too late. His eyes widened in horror as the steel gate rushed toward the windshield. He scrambled to find the brake pedal, but his polished shoes slipped off the edge, catching on the floor mat. The impact was deafening. The front bumper of the Porsche struck the reinforced steel gate at nearly 60 miles per hour. The sound of crunching metal and shattering glass echoed through the subterranean garage like a bomb detonating in a canyon. The kinetic force of the crash folded the hood of the luxury vehicle upward like a crushed tin can. The engine block cracked, hissing steam and leaking dark fluids across the concrete ramp. Inside the cabin, the airbags deployed with a violent, explosive crack, filling the interior with a cloud of white chemical powder. The sheer force of the sudden deceleration threw Julian forward, his head snapping back against the headrest. The vehicle came to a dead halt, pinned against the unyielding steel barrier, its horn blaring in a continuous shrill wail that pierced the quiet night. I looked away from the tablet screen. I turned to face my family. The sharp, continuous sound of the car alarm echoed faintly up the elevator shaft, reaching the silent penthouse. Julian had attempted to outrun a digital trap and ended up imprisoned inside a cage of twisted metal. His escape was over, but the real consequences were just beginning to arrive. The shrill, continuous wail of the sports car alarm pierced the concrete foundation of the luxury high-rise, vibrating through the floorboards of the penthouse. I did not rush toward the exit. I handed the encrypted tablet back to the enforcer standing in the foyer. We walked toward the private elevator with measured, deliberate steps. Richard and Beverly followed closely behind, drawn by the morbid compulsion to witness the physical wreckage of their golden child. The ride down to the subterranean parking level felt like descending into a concrete tomb. The polished steel doors parted, revealing a scene of absolute mechanical devastation. The air in the subterranean garage tasted of aerosolized chemical powder from the deployed airbags mixed with the sharp, acrid sting of leaking engine coolant. The sleek black Porsche was entirely unrecognizable. The reinforced steel security gate had acted like a brutal industrial shear, folding the front hood backward and shattering the windshield into thousands of opaque crystalline fragments. Dark oil pooled beneath the cracked engine block, creeping slowly across the polished concrete floor. The driver's side door groaned, fighting against warped metal hinges before kicking open. Julian stumbled out of the cabin. His bespoke tuxedo was coated in a thick layer of white chemical dust, but he possessed no visible lacerations. Modern automotive engineering had absorbed the lethal kinetic force of the impact, sparing his life. He stood upright, leaning against the concrete pillar, his chest heaving with rapid, shallow breaths. He looked at the ruined luxury vehicle. He looked at the unyielding steel gate. Then his eyes darted toward the high-definition security cameras mounted on the ceiling fixtures. A dark, opportunistic calculation flickered across his face. Julian knew his offshore accounts were frozen by the federal algorithms. He knew he owed the Shadow Credit Syndicate a staggering $2 million in default penalties. He needed an immediate influx of untraceable capital to fund his escape and hire a defense attorney. He recognized an opportunity to manufacture a golden parachute out of twisted metal. Personal injury litigation against a commercial property owner can yield catastrophic financial settlements. If he sustained a debilitating spinal injury while fleeing a hostile threat on my property, My commercial liability insurance would face immense pressure to settle the claim out of court to avoid a lengthy public trial. Julian did not hesitate. His survival instinct mutated into pure calculated deceit. He collapsed onto the cold concrete floor. He clutched his cervical spine, contorting his body into a twisted, unnatural posture. He let out a series of agonizing, practiced groans, ensuring his vocal performance echoed loudly through the parking structure. He closed his eyes, feigning partial paralysis, transforming himself from a fleeing corporate spy into a helpless victim of circumstance. Beverly rushed out of the elevator, her trench coat flapping behind her. She saw Julian writhing on the ground amidst the spilled oil and shattered glass. For a brief second, genuine panic registered on her face, but Julian opened one eye and caught her gaze. He offered a subtle, sharp nod, gesturing toward his neck and then tilting his head slightly in my direction. Beverly understood the assignment immediately. She possessed a lifetime of experience fabricating reality to suit her social narrative. She recognized the legal strategy forming on the concrete floor. She pulled her smartphone from her pocket and dialed emergency services. She did not request an ambulance with the calm urgency of a concerned relative. She weaponized her tears, performing a masterpiece of theatrical hysteria for the emergency dispatcher. She wailed into the receiver, claiming her son-in-law was dying on the floor and that he could not feel his legs. She escalated the lie with chilling precision. Beverly pointed a trembling finger directly at me while speaking to the operator. She fabricated a violent narrative claiming I had chased Julian out of the penthouse wielding a heavy brass sculpture. She stated I had threatened his life, driving him into a state of mortal terror that forced him to crash the vehicle in a desperate bid to escape my assault. She was laying the legal groundwork for a multi-million-dollar premises liability lawsuit. She intended to drain my corporate insurance policy to fund their resurrection. She provided the dispatcher with a detailed fictitious account of my unhinged aggression, ensuring the police would arrive prepared to arrest me for aggravated assault. I stood 10 feet away, observing the grotesque theatrical production. The enforcer from the credit syndicate remained silent by my side, a stoic witness to their perjury. I did not interrupt her phone call. I did not bother explaining that the garage security cameras captured Julian sprinting to the vehicle entirely alone. I did not mention that the penthouse audio network had recorded our entire interaction, proving no physical threats were ever issued. I let her weave her elaborate web of lies. Lying to a federal emergency dispatcher to orchestrate a fraudulent insurance claim constitutes a severe felony offense. Beverly was eagerly digging her own cell right next to Julian. The elevator chime echoed a second time, cutting through the blaring car alarm. Chloe stepped into the dim fluorescent light of the parking garage. She wore her rumpled silk blouse, her face pale and drawn. She looked at the smoking wreckage of the leased sports car. She looked at Julian rolling on the ground, clutching his neck and screaming about spinal damage. She looked at her mother, weeping into the smartphone, painting me as a violent criminal. Chloe did not rush forward to comfort her husband. She did not fall to her knees or join the hysterical performance. Her eyes were hollow, devoid of any emotional connection to the man bleeding on the floor. She stared at the crushed hood of the vehicle with a cold, detached calculation. Julian gritted his teeth, maintaining his charade for the cameras. He whispered loudly enough for Chloe to hear, instructing her to contact the auto insurance provider immediately. He told her to file a total loss claim for the vehicle and prepare the medical liability paperwork for his impending hospital stay. He promised the impending payout would save them from the syndicate and fund their escape. Chloe stared at the twisted metal. Her voice lacked any inflection when she spoke. She informed Julian that there was no auto insurance provider to call. Julian stopped groaning. He lowered his hands from his neck, staring up at his wife in pure confusion. Chloe revealed the brutal truth with surgical indifference. When the federal freeze hit their accounts the previous afternoon, her lucrative influencer sponsorships vanished instantly. She realized she needed liquid cash to book her escape flight to Europe and secure a hidden hotel room. She had logged into the primary insurance portal, utilizing Julian's administrative passwords. She manually canceled the comprehensive auto policy covering the Porsche. She authorized the immediate termination of the coverage to trigger a prorated refund of the prepaid annual premium, routing the recovered cash directly into her anonymous digital wallet. The policy was officially terminated effective at midnight. The vehicle crashed at 1:00 a.m. The revelation hit Julian harder than the reinforced steel gate. The fraudulent personal injury lawsuit he had just fabricated required an active chain of insured liability to function. By canceling the policy, Chloe had severed their only financial safety net. The Porsche was a high-performance leased vehicle valued at $200,000. The reinforced security gate belonged to the luxury high-rise management corporation and would cost tens of thousands of dollars to replace. The impending ambulance ride, the emergency room evaluation, and the radiological scans he was currently demanding would generate staggering medical bills. Without an active insurance policy, the financial liability for the destroyed corporate property, the totaled sports car, and the medical charade fell directly onto Julian's personal ledger. The leasing company would sue him for the full value of the vehicle. The building management would sue him for the structural damage. He was already drowning in a $2 million syndicate debt. His offshore accounts were frozen by the federal government. He faced decades in prison for corporate espionage. And now his own wife, driven by her relentless vanity and greed, had just strapped an uninsurable anchor to his feet, ensuring his total financial annihilation. Julian lay on the cold concrete, staring at the shattered windshield, realizing the sirens wailing in the distance were not coming to save him. They were coming to bury him under a mountain of debt he could never repay. The wailing of emergency sirens echoed down the concrete ramp of the subterranean parking garage, growing louder with every passing second. The harsh noise bounced off the reinforced pillars, cutting through the continuous shrill alarm of the ruined sports car. Red and blue strobe lights sliced through the dim fluorescent gloom, painting the thick cloud of chemical airbag dust in stark, shifting colors. Two Metropolitan police cruisers skidded to a halt near the shattered security gate, followed closely by a heavy rescue ambulance. Paramedics poured out of the rear doors of the ambulance, carrying a rigid backboard and a cervical collar. They moved with practiced urgency, trained to treat severe trauma incidents. They spotted Julian writhing on the cold concrete floor, clutching his neck and groaning in theatrical agony. They rushed to his side, dropping to their knees in the slick puddle of leaking engine coolant and shattered headlight glass. Beverly did not waste a single moment. She launched into the second act of her fabricated performance. She intercepted the lead police officer rushing out of the primary cruiser. She grabbed the sleeve of his dark uniform, weeping hysterically. She pointed a trembling finger directly at me, standing quietly 10 feet away. Beverly repeated the intricate lie she had delivered to the emergency dispatcher. She claimed I had chased her son-in-law out of the penthouse, wielding a heavy brass sculpture threatening his life and driving him into a state of blind panic. She demanded the officer arrest me for aggravated assault and attempted murder. The lead officer, a seasoned veteran with graying hair and sharp, observant eyes, placed a calming hand on Beverly's shoulder. He instructed her to step back and take a deep breath. He unclipped the heavy flashlight from his utility belt and turned his attention toward me. He expected to find a belligerent suspect holding a weapon or attempting to flee the scene of a violent domestic dispute. He found a woman standing perfectly still, wearing a tailored wool trench coat, her hands empty and visible, holding only a sleek digital tablet. I did not flinch when the beam of his flashlight swept over me. I did not raise my voice to argue with my mother or defend my character against her perjury. I simply waited for the officer to approach. I am the primary lion holder of this property. I stated, my voice calm and echoing clearly over the noise of the emergency vehicles. I did not chase that man. I did not threaten him. He fled the penthouse on his own accord following a financial dispute. The officer frowned, glancing between my stoic posture and the weeping woman behind him. Beverly shrieked, calling me a liar and demanding he place me in handcuffs. I did not offer a verbal rebuttal. I lifted the encrypted tablet and tapped the screen, waking the high-definition display. I had already cued the precise segment of the closed-circuit security footage. I handed the device to the lead officer. The digital truth requires no emotional inflection. The officer looked down at the screen, watching the pristine overhead angle of the parking garage. The video feed displayed Julian bursting through the heavy steel doors of the emergency stairwell. He was entirely alone. The stairwell behind him was empty. There was no brass sculpture. There was no violent pursuit. The footage captured Julian fumbling with his silver key fob, throwing himself into the driver's seat and slamming his foot onto the accelerator. The officer watched the luxury vehicle spin its tires, lose traction, and plow directly into the reinforced steel gate without a single external threat provoking the crash. The seasoned cop handed the tablet back to me, his jaw tightening. He turned his head and looked at Beverly. The sympathetic demeanor he had offered her just moments ago evaporated. He informed my mother in a low warning tone that providing false statements to a sworn officer to initiate a fraudulent arrest constitutes a severe criminal offense. Beverly closed her mouth, her theatrical tears drying instantly, as she realized her perjury was documented on a high-definition server. Near the smoking wreckage of the sports car, the The medical evaluation was reaching a similar conclusion. The paramedics had applied the cervical collar and were conducting a rapid trauma assessment. The lead medic ran his gloved hands along Julian's spine, checking for structural deformities or fluid leakage. He shined a diagnostic pen light into Julian's eyes, checking for neurological deficits. Julian continued to moan, complaining of shooting pains down his legs and a loss of motor function. The lead paramedic sat back on his heels, peeling off his latex gloves. He looked up at the police officer walking toward the wreck. The paramedic shook his head, delivering the medical verdict with professional annoyance. His vitals are elevated from adrenaline, but his pupillary response is perfect, the paramedic reported. There is no swelling, no bruising, and no physical indication of spinal trauma. He possesses full reflex function in his lower extremities. The injury is a complete fabrication. Julian stopped groaning. He opened his eyes, looking up at the stern faces of the police officer and the paramedic. The elaborate insurance fraud scheme he had just constructed crumbled into dust before he could even file the initial paperwork. The lead officer reached down and grabbed Julian by the collar of his ruined bespoke tuxedo. He hauled the corporate spy off the cold concrete floor with effortless strength. Julian stumbled, his polished shoes sliding in the spilled oil. He tried to speak, attempting to weave a new narrative about slippery pedals or a mechanical malfunction, but the officer was done listening to lies. "Julian, you are under arrest," the officer announced, spinning the executive around and forcing his hands behind his back. The sharp metallic ratcheting of steel handcuffs echoed through the garage, cutting through the lingering hum of the emergency lights. The cold metal bit into Julian's wrists, locking him in place. "You are being charged with filing a false police report." The officer continued reciting the charges with mechanical precision. "You are also being cited for reckless destruction of commercial property. Furthermore, a routine plate check indicates the liability insurance on this vehicle was terminated at midnight. Operating an uninsured motor vehicle resulting in catastrophic property damage is a strict liability offense." Julian sagged against the grip of the officer, his chin dropping to his chest. The white chemical dust from the airbags coated his hair, making him look like an aged, defeated ghost. He was dragged across the concrete and deposited into the cramped plastic back seat of the police cruiser. The heavy door slammed shut, sealing him inside a mobile cage. Richard and Beverly stood frozen near the concrete pillars. They watched the flashing red and blue lights illuminate the face of their son-in-law pressed against the reinforced glass of the cruiser window. Their minds raced, processing the catastrophic legal reality of his arrest. The $10 million generational trust fund Julian had stolen from them was currently frozen in a digital void. If Julian went to federal prison for corporate espionage and local jail for insurance fraud, that money would remain locked forever or be seized entirely by government auditors. He was the only person possessing the encrypted passwords to the Cayman Island Shell Company. They needed him out of a jail cell. They needed him to negotiate a plea deal and recover their stolen wealth. They realized the only person holding the power to sink or save Julian was Chloe. She was his legal wife. She had signed the incorporation papers for the offshore shell company. If Chloe accepted a federal immunity deal and testified against him in court, Julian would face maximum sentencing and the $10 million would be permanently confiscated. Richard broke away from the concrete pillar and rushed toward his youngest daughter. Beverly followed, her hands trembling. They cornered Chloe near the edge of the oil spill. "Chloe, you have to protect him," Richard pleaded, his voice cracking with desperate urgency. "You are his wife. You possess spousal privilege. You have to refuse to testify against him. We need him to beat these charges. He promised he could unfreeze the accounts and return our money once the heat dies down. If you turn on him, we lose everything forever." Beverly grabbed Chloe's arm, nodding frantically. "Please, sweetheart." Beverly begged, shedding genuine tears of profound terror. "Be a loyal wife. Do not speak to the federal agents. Help us save the family legacy." Chloe looked at her parents. She looked at their ruined designer coats and their panicked, bloodshot eyes. She did not see a mother and father begging for their survival. She saw an opportunity. She knew her own financial situation was dire. She owed my shadow syndicate $500,000 due to the triggered default penalty. She needed massive liquid capital immediately to pay off the ruthless debt collectors and secure her own legal defense. She also knew that while Richard had liquidated his generational trust fund to buy floating shares earlier that week, the transaction had failed when my holding company flooded the market with a massive short position, crashing the stock, and he and Beverly still possessed one final untouched asset. Federal law protects individual retirement accounts from standard commercial liquidations. Richard and Beverly each held a substantial 401k portfolio accumulated over 40 years of executive employment. Combined, those retirement accounts held nearly $2 million in protected index funds. Chloe slowly pulled her arm out of her mother's grasp. She smoothed the wrinkles in her silk blouse, projecting a cold, calculating demeanor she had learned directly from the man sitting in the back of the police cruiser. "I will invoke spousal privilege," Chloe stated, her voice devoid of any familial warmth. "I will refuse to cooperate with the federal prosecutors. I will play the role of the devoted wife and give Julian the chance to recover your stolen trust fund." Richard let out a massive sigh of relief, his shoulders slumping. He reached out to hug her, but Chloe took a step back, raising a hand to stop him. "But loyalty is not free." Chloe continued, delivering the cruelest ultimatum of the night. "I am facing severe legal liabilities because of his actions. I need guaranteed security." Richard frowned, confusion masking his relief. "What do you mean, Chloe?" "Tomorrow morning you will contact your respective financial brokers," Chloe instructed, her tone flat and unyielding. "You will initiate an emergency early withdrawal of your entire 401k retirement portfolios. You will accept the heavy tax penalties for liquidating the accounts prematurely. Then you will wire every single remaining cent directly into an anonymous digital wallet that I control." Beverly gasped, raising a hand to her mouth. Richard stared at his daughter, his eyes wide with sheer disbelief. "That is our retirement fund," Richard whispered, his voice trembling. "That is the only money we have left in the world to survive on. You are asking us to render ourselves completely destitute." Chloe did not blink. She looked at the parents who had spoiled her for decades, recognizing that their blind indulgence had taught her to prioritize her own survival above all else. "If you do not sign over your retirement funds by noon tomorrow, I will walk directly into the Federal Bureau of Investigation." Chloe promised, a ruthless smirk touching the corners of her mouth. "I will hand them the laptop containing his offshore routing numbers. I will testify to every single fraud he committed. Julian will spend the rest of his life in a concrete cell, and the government will incinerate your $10 million trust. You can choose to retire in poverty, or you can choose to lose your legacy forever. The choice is yours." The flashing red and blue lights of the Metropolitan Police cruisers painted the subterranean parking garage in sharp, rhythmic colors. Julian sat locked in the back of the patrol vehicle, his face pressed against the reinforced glass, watching the wreckage of his life smolder. The $10 million generational trust fund he had stolen was permanently frozen in a digital void, rendering him penniless. He owed a shadow syndicate $2 million in default penalties. He faced federal prison for corporate espionage and local charges for insurance fraud. And his own wife had just strapped an uninsurable anchor to his feet, ensuring his total financial annihilation. I stood a few yards away, observing the final devastating tableau. The corporate warfare was over. The enforcer from the credit syndicate stood silently beside me. The syndicate would trace Chloe's digital wallet and extract their penalty payments from the retirement funds she had just extorted from her parents. My family had consumed each other, driven by their relentless vanity and greed. I turned my back on the flashing lights and the weeping figures. I walked toward the private elevator, leaving them in the cold concrete garage to face the crushing consequences of their own arrogance. The metal doors slid shut, sealing the ruins of the Sterling family empire. The driver's side door groaned, fighting against warped metal hinges before kicking open. Julian stumbled out of the cabin. His bespoke tuxedo was coated in a thick layer of white chemical dust, but he possessed no visible lacerations. Modern automotive engineering had absorbed the lethal kinetic force of the impact, sparing his life. He stood upright, leaning against the concrete pillar, his chest heaving with rapid, shallow breaths. He looked at the ruined luxury vehicle. He looked at the unyielding steel gate. Then his eyes darted toward the high-definition security cameras mounted on the ceiling fixtures. A dark, opportunistic calculation flickered across his face. Julian knew his offshore accounts were frozen by the federal algorithms. He knew he owed the Shadow Credit Syndicate a staggering $2 million in default penalties. He needed an immediate influx of untraceable capital to fund his escape and hire a defense attorney. He recognized an opportunity to manufacture a golden parachute out of twisted metal. Personal injury litigation against a commercial property owner can yield catastrophic financial settlements. If he sustained a debilitating spinal injury while fleeing a hostile threat on my property, my commercial liability insurance would face immense pressure to settle the claim out of court to avoid a lengthy public trial. Julian did not hesitate. His survival instinct mutated into pure calculated deceit. He collapsed onto the cold concrete floor. He clutched his cervical spine, contorting his body into a twisted, unnatural posture. He let out a series of agonizing, practiced groans, ensuring his vocal performance echoed loudly through the parking structure. He closed his eyes, feigning partial paralysis, transforming himself from a fleeing corporate spy into a helpless victim of circumstance. Beverly rushed out of the elevator, her trench coat flapping behind her. She saw Julian writhing on the ground amidst the spilled oil and shattered glass. For a brief second, genuine panic registered on her face, but Julian opened one eye and caught her gaze. He offered a subtle, sharp nod, gesturing toward his neck and then tilting his head slightly in my direction. Beverly understood the assignment immediately. She possessed a lifetime of experience fabricating reality to suit her social narrative. She recognized the legal strategy forming on the concrete floor. She pulled her smartphone from her pocket and dialed emergency services. She did not request an ambulance with the calm urgency of a concerned relative. She weaponized her tears, performing a masterpiece of theatrical hysteria for the emergency dispatcher. She wailed into the receiver, claiming her son-in-law was dying on the floor and that he could not feel his legs. She escalated the lie with chilling precision. Beverly pointed a trembling finger directly at me while speaking to the operator. She fabricated a violent narrative, claiming I had chased Julian out of the penthouse wielding a heavy brass sculpture. She stated I had threatened his life, driving him into a state of mortal terror that forced him to crash the vehicle in a desperate bid to escape my assault. She was laying the legal groundwork for a multi-million-dollar premises liability lawsuit. She intended to drain my corporate insurance policy to fund their resurrection. She provided the dispatcher with a detailed, fictitious account of my unhinged aggression, ensuring the police would arrive prepared to arrest me for aggravated assault. I stood 10 feet away, observing the grotesque theatrical production. The enforcer from the credit syndicate remained silent by my side, a stoic witness to their perjury. I did not interrupt her phone call. I did not bother explaining that the garage security cameras captured Julian sprinting to the vehicle entirely alone. I did not mention that the penthouse audio network had recorded our entire interaction, proving no physical threats were ever issued. I let her weave her elaborate web of lies. Lying to a federal emergency dispatcher to orchestrate a fraudulent insurance claim constitutes a severe felony offense. Beverly was eagerly digging her own cell right next to Julian. The elevator chime echoed a second time, cutting through the blaring car alarm. Chloe stepped into the dim fluorescent light of the parking garage. She wore her rumpled silk blouse, her face pale and drawn. She looked at the smoking wreckage of the leased sports car. She looked at Julian rolling on the ground, clutching his neck and screaming about spinal damage. She looked at her mother, weeping into the smartphone, painting me as a violent criminal. Chloe did not rush forward to comfort her husband. She did not fall to her knees or join the hysterical performance. Her eyes were hollow, devoid of any emotional connection to the man bleeding on the floor. She stared at the crushed hood of the vehicle with a cold, detached calculation. Julian gritted his teeth, maintaining his charade for the cameras. He whispered loudly enough for Chloe to hear, instructing her to contact the auto insurance provider immediately. He told her to file a total loss claim for the vehicle and prepare the medical liability paperwork for his impending hospital stay. He promised the impending payout would save them from the syndicate and fund their escape. Chloe stared at the twisted metal. Her voice lacked any inflection when she spoke. She informed Julian that there was no auto insurance provider to call. Julian stopped groaning. He lowered his hands from his neck, staring up at his wife in pure confusion. Chloe revealed the brutal truth with surgical indifference. When the federal freeze hit their accounts the previous afternoon, her lucrative influencer sponsorships vanished instantly. She realized she needed liquid cash to book her escape flight to Europe and secure a hidden hotel room. She had logged into the primary insurance portal, utilizing Julian's administrative passwords. She manually canceled the comprehensive auto policy covering the Porsche. She authorized the immediate termination of the coverage to trigger a prorated refund of the prepaid annual premium, routing the recovered cash directly into her anonymous digital wallet. The policy was officially terminated effective at midnight. The vehicle crashed at 1:00 a.m. The revelation hit Julian harder than the reinforced steel gate. The fraudulent personal injury lawsuit he had just fabricated required an active chain of insured liability to function. By canceling the policy, Chloe had severed their only financial safety net. The Porsche was a high-performance leased vehicle valued at $200,000. The reinforced security gate belonged to the luxury high-rise management corporation and would cost tens of thousands of dollars to replace. The impending ambulance ride, the emergency room evaluation, and the radiological scans he was currently demanding would generate staggering medical bills. Without an active insurance policy, the financial liability for the destroyed corporate property, the totaled sports car, and the medical charade fell directly onto Julian's personal ledger. The leasing company would sue him for the full value of the vehicle. The building management would sue him for the structural damage. He was already drowning in a $2 million syndicate debt. His offshore accounts were frozen by the federal government. He faced decades in prison for corporate espionage. And now his own wife, driven by her relentless vanity and greed, had just strapped an uninsurable anchor to his feet, ensuring his total financial annihilation. Julian lay on the cold concrete, staring at the shattered windshield, realizing the sirens wailing in the distance were not coming to save him. They were coming to bury him under a mountain of debt he could never repay. The wailing of emergency sirens echoed down the concrete ramp of the subterranean parking garage, growing louder with every passing second. The harsh noise bounced off the reinforced pillars, cutting through the continuous shrill alarm of the ruined sports car. Red and blue strobe lights sliced through the dim fluorescent gloom, painting the thick cloud of chemical airbag dust in stark, shifting colors. Two Metropolitan police cruisers skidded to a halt near the shattered security gate, followed closely by a heavy rescue ambulance. Paramedics poured out of the rear doors of the ambulance, carrying a rigid backboard and a cervical collar. They moved with practiced urgency, trained to treat severe trauma incidents. They spotted Julian writhing on the cold concrete floor, clutching his neck and groaning in theatrical agony. They rushed to his side, dropping to their knees in the slick puddle of leaking engine coolant and shattered headlight glass. Beverly did not waste a single moment. She launched into the second act of her fabricated performance. She intercepted the lead police officer rushing out of the primary cruiser. She grabbed the sleeve of his dark uniform, weeping hysterically. She pointed a trembling finger directly at me, standing quietly 10 feet away. Beverly repeated the intricate lie she had delivered to the emergency dispatcher. She claimed I had chased her son-in-law out of the penthouse, wielding a heavy brass sculpture, threatening his life and driving him into a state of blind panic. She demanded the officer arrest me for aggravated assault and attempted murder. The lead officer, a seasoned veteran with graying hair and sharp, observant eyes, placed a calming hand on Beverly's shoulder. He instructed her to step back and take a deep breath. He unclipped the heavy flashlight from his utility belt and turned his attention toward me. He expected to find a belligerent suspect holding a weapon or attempting to flee the scene of a violent domestic dispute. He found a woman standing perfectly still, wearing a tailored wool trench coat, her hands empty and visible, holding only a sleek digital tablet. I did not flinch when the beam of his flashlight swept over me. I did not raise my voice to argue with my mother or defend my character against her perjury. I simply waited for the officer to approach. "I am the primary lion holder of this property," I stated, my voice calm and echoing clearly over the noise of the emergency vehicles. "I did not chase that man. I did not threaten him. He fled the penthouse on his own accord following a financial dispute." The officer frowned, glancing between my stoic posture and the weeping woman behind him. Beverly shrieked, calling me a liar and demanding he place me in handcuffs. I did not offer a verbal rebuttal. I lifted the encrypted tablet and tapped the screen, waking the high-definition display. I had already cued the precise segment of the closed-circuit security footage. I handed the device to the lead officer. The digital truth requires no emotional inflection. The officer looked down at the screen, watching the pristine overhead angle of the parking garage. The video feed displayed Julian bursting through the heavy steel doors of the emergency stairwell. He was entirely alone. The stairwell behind him was empty. There was no brass sculpture. There was no violent pursuit. The footage captured Julian fumbling with his silver key fob, throwing himself into the driver's seat and slamming his foot onto the accelerator. The officer watched the luxury vehicle spin its tires, lose traction, and plow directly into the reinforced steel gate without a single external threat provoking the crash. The seasoned cop handed the tablet back to me, his jaw tightening. He turned his head and looked at Beverly. The sympathetic demeanor he had offered her just moments ago evaporated. He informed my mother in a low warning tone that providing false statements to a sworn officer to initiate a fraudulent arrest constitutes a severe criminal offense. Beverly closed her mouth, her theatrical tears drying instantly, as she realized her perjury was documented on a high-definition server. Near the smoking wreckage of the sports car, the medical evaluation was reaching a similar conclusion. The paramedics had applied the cervical collar and were conducting a rapid trauma assessment. The lead medic ran his gloved hands along Julian's spine, checking for structural deformities or fluid leakage. He shined a diagnostic pen light into Julian's eyes, checking for neurological deficits. Julian continued to moan, complaining of shooting pains down his legs and a loss of motor function. The lead paramedic sat back on his heels, peeling off his latex gloves. He looked up at the police officer walking toward the wreck. The paramedic shook his head, delivering the medical verdict with professional annoyance. His vitals are elevated from adrenaline, but his pupillary response is perfect, the paramedic reported. There is no swelling, no bruising, and no physical indication of spinal trauma. He possesses full reflex function in his lower extremities. The injury is a complete fabrication. Julian stopped groaning. He opened his eyes, looking up at the stern faces of the police officer and the paramedic. The elaborate insurance fraud scheme he had just constructed crumbled into dust before he could even file the initial paperwork. The lead officer reached down and grabbed Julian by the collar of his ruined bespoke tuxedo. He hauled the corporate spy off the cold concrete floor with effortless strength. Julian stumbled, his polished shoes sliding in the spilled oil. He tried to speak, attempting to weave a new narrative about slippery pedals or a mechanical malfunction, but the officer was done listening to lies. "Julian, you are under arrest," the officer announced, spinning the executive around and forcing his hands behind his back. The sharp metallic ratcheting of steel handcuffs echoed through the garage, cutting through the lingering hum of the emergency lights. The cold metal bit into Julian's wrists, locking him in place. "You are being charged with filing a false police report." The officer continued reciting the charges with mechanical precision. "You are also being cited for reckless destruction of commercial property. Furthermore, a routine plate check indicates the liability insurance on this vehicle was terminated at midnight. Operating an uninsured motor vehicle resulting in catastrophic property damage is a strict liability offense." Julian sagged against the grip of the officer, his chin dropping to his chest. The white chemical dust from the airbags coated his hair, making him look like an aged, defeated ghost. He was dragged across the concrete and deposited into the cramped plastic back seat of the police cruiser. The heavy door slammed shut, sealing him inside a mobile cage. Richard and Beverly stood frozen near the concrete pillars. They watched the flashing red and blue lights illuminate the face of their son-in-law pressed against the reinforced glass of the cruiser window. Their minds raced, processing the catastrophic legal reality of his arrest. The $10 million generational trust fund Julian had stolen from them was currently frozen in a digital void. If Julian went to federal prison for corporate espionage and local jail for insurance fraud, that money would remain locked forever or be seized entirely by government auditors. He was the only person possessing the encrypted passwords to the Cayman Island Shell Company. They needed him out of a jail cell. They needed him to negotiate a plea deal and recover their stolen wealth. They realized the only person holding the power to sink or save Julian was Chloe. She was his legal wife. She had signed the incorporation papers for the offshore shell company.